Hook, there is no haste here. The night stretches endlessly, the candle burns low, and the air is thick with the faint smell of beeswax, old parchment, and the whisper of a breeze through cracks in the stone. We are not in the quick hours of the day, we are in the slow hours, the hours when dust moves like drifting snow across a table that no hand has cleaned in a season. Somewhere far beyond the edges of the known map, metals lie in their veins untouched. Somewhere in quiet rooms, hands stir the contents of copper pans over coals that glow but do not blaze. Here in this world, time is not measured by clocks, but by the slow darkening of wax, the settling of ash, the weary turning of a page. And so, if you are to hear the truth, not the quick tales told in taverns, not the bright legends of gold appearing overnight, but the dark truth of medieval alchemy, then you must listen in the way these men and women worked, with patience, with slowness, with an ear for what is barely said. We will walk together, not briskly, but as though we are moving through a hallway lined with heavy tapestries, each step muffled, each moment stretched until you might forget the hour entirely. Let the mind loosen its grip, let the eyes grow heavy, let the story begin. Chapter 1. The first flicker of gold, it began not with the clang of hammers or the glitter of coins, but with a whisper from Alexandria, where Greek, Egyptian, and Arabic thought mingled in the shadowy corridors of the great libraries. There, in a time when Rome had already fallen and Europe sat shrouded in the mists of what some would later call the Dark Ages, scraps of knowledge drifted westward, scraps about metals, about transformation, about the belief that nature could be persuaded slowly into new shapes. The manuscripts were not clear, and perhaps they were never meant to be. An alchemist of the 12th century, if you could look over his shoulder, would be hunched over parchment filled with looping, uneven letters, with drawings of suns and moons, of vessels with strange necks and bulbous bellies, of animals that were never meant to be taken literally. He would pause often, not because the work was hard, but because the mind wandered in the quiet. The lamp flickered. A sound in the rafters might make him stop and stare at the wall. The world outside moved differently. A winter might pass before a rare powder arrived from a distant city, carried on a mule through weeks of mud and snow. A summer might vanish before a certain text could be copied by hand in a monastery's scriptorium. The first flicker of gold, the idea of it, was not in a crucible, but in the patient passing of time. It is easy to imagine, if you close your eyes, the first medieval scholar leaning close over his alembic, watching the slow swirl of vapours rise and cool in glass. His breath would cloud in the air, for the stone room was cold. His fingers would stain from grinding minerals in a mortar. And yet there was nothing yet to show for his work. Days passed, weeks, sometimes entire seasons, with nothing to display but a thicker layer of dust upon the shelf. The dark truth, even here at the beginning, was that alchemy was never quick. It was not a blaze of discovery. It was a dim ember kept alive against the endless dark. The first medieval alchemists did not call themselves by that name. They might have been known simply as philosophers, naturalists, or practitioners of the ars magna, the great art. The word alchemy itself wandered slowly into the tongues of Europe, its roots tangled in the Arabic alchemia, which itself had drawn nourishment from older Greek and Egyptian traditions. It was a word that, like the craft itself, was layered with the dust of centuries and the echo of distant voices. In those early years, the work was as much about preservation as transformation. Knowledge, fragile and rare, was copied by patient hands onto parchment scraped thin from the hides of sheep or goats. The script was uneven, the ink sometimes fading where the scribe's lamp had smoked. And between the lines of practical notes on heating times and vessel shapes, there were always metaphors. The green lion that devours the sun, the marriage of the red king and the white queen, the black crow of dissolution. To the alchemist, they were memory hooks, a way of holding secrets in the mind without spilling them too easily into the wrong ears. A man in a narrow stone room might spend an afternoon simply watching a slow drip of condensed vapour along the curve of glass, convinced that in its rhythm lay a message from nature herself. And while he watched, the world outside crept forward in its own patient rhythm. Carts groaning on wooden wheels over muddy roads, bells tolling the slow hours from the church tower, the market closing as dusk folded over the thatched roofs. Gold was not yet the goal for all. Some sought medicine in the form of the elixir of life, Some sought dyes that would cling brighter to cloth, or inks that would endure longer on parchment. Others wanted to understand the hidden order of nature, believing that if one could see the secret threads, one might tug upon them and change the weave. But the idea of making gold from what was not gold, hovered always at the edge of the mind, like a dream half remembered upon waking. The dark truth, though seldom spoken aloud, was that the first flicker of gold was more often a flicker of candlelight caught upon a brass rim or a copper plate. In those cramped rooms, the illusion of transformation came easily in the warm, shifting glow of firelight. One might hold a dull metal to the flame and swear it gleamed more richly than before. In that moment, hope stirred, and hope, once stirred, was harder to extinguish than any coal in the hearth. The alchemists' tools were humble, yet they carried the weight of centuries. A retort shaped like a bird's beak for guiding vapours. A crucible blackened and cracked from heat for holding the dreams of molten change. A mortar and pestle for grinding stones and minerals into dust fine enough to slip through the fingers. And always the books, leather-bound, their pages smelling faintly of smoke and animal skin, filled with diagrams whose meaning shifted depending on the reader's patience. In the stillness of such a workshop, the alchemist might feel that he was not working alone, that in the faint hiss of cooling metal, in the lazy swirl of a settling liquid, there was the voice of the ancients, speaking softly through the veil of time. To follow alchemy was to step into a river whose source lay beyond the reach of memory, and to let oneself be carried ever so slowly towards some unseen sea, but the river was not without shadows. Even here, at its quiet beginning in the medieval world, there was the knowledge, whispered in cloisters, muttered in markets, that to meddle too deeply with nature's order was to risk more than failure. Some believed the work skirted the edges of heresy, that to try and change the metals of the earth was to step into the realm of divine prerogative. Others feared that the pursuit could unbalance the mind, leading a man to see signs in every cloud of vapour, omens in every spark from the coals. And yet they worked on, slowly, quietly, as one works at a task too consuming to abandon, even if the end is always beyond sight. The first flicker of gold, then, was not an object. It was a state of mind, a patient watching. A belief that in the right combination of fire and water, of earth and air, of mercury, sulphur and salt, the world might yield up a deeper truth. And in that belief there was a kind of gold already. Not in the purse, but in the heart, heavy enough to keep a man bending over his workbench long into the night. The seasons in those years did not rush forward as they do now. Winter settled in and stayed, its cold breath frosting the insides of unshuttered windows, creeping into the joints of wooden benches, making ink grow thick and reluctant in its pot. Summer, when it came, arrived not with fireworks but with a slow unfolding. The smell of herbs drying in bunches, the hum of bees moving lazily through sunlit gardens. An alchemist's work bent to the seasons, for heat and dryness and light each played their part in experiments that could not be hurried. If the crucible cracked, there would be no replacement for months. If a rare mineral spoiled in dampness, the next shipment might be years away. In those gaps of waiting, the mind did not idle. Instead, it circled back over old notes, tracing the same lines again and again, as though a truth might suddenly reveal itself where it had been hidden before. It is said by some that the earliest medieval alchemists believed in a prima materia, a first matter from which all things sprang, pure, undifferentiated like clay before the sculptor's hand. They dreamed that if they could only find it, they could coax it into becoming anything. Gold, silver, jewels, medicines, even life prolonged beyond its natural span. But the search for this elusive substance was not a hunt in the forests or the mine. It was a hunt in the mind, in the curling smoke above the furnace, in the pale sediment left after a distillation, in the feel of ground powder between the fingers. The rooms in which they worked were small but thick with presence. The shelves bowed under the weight of jars filled with powders in shades of ochre, grey, green and rust. Bundles of dried plants dangled from beams, their scents mingling with the sharper smells of heated metals and the faint bitterness of vinegar used to clean glassware. The light was never bright. It came filtered through small warped panes of glass or fell in a dim circle from an oil lamp, flickering in the faintest draught. And always there was the sound, not of busy clamour, but of the patient noises that mark work done in stillness, the scrape of a pestle in a mortar, the creak of a stool as its occupant shifted, the soft sigh of steam escaping from a vessel. In such an atmosphere, hours blurred together. The sun could sink and rise again, and the alchemist would hardly notice except for the change in the colour of the light. The idea of gold was both a beacon and a burden. To make gold from what was not gold would be the ultimate proof of mastery over nature. But mastery in this craft was not wrested from the world in sudden triumph. It was courted, coaxed, persuaded over long years, like a shy animal that might never fully approach. And so, many worked without ever seeing the thing they sought, their lives spent in the shadow of an unfulfilled hope. There were moments when the illusion came close enough to touch. A dull metal, carefully polished and treated with certain substances, could gleam yellow enough to stir excitement. A molten mixture might swirl with colours that seemed to promise transformation. Yet the truth, the dark truth, was that most of these glimmers were fleeting tricks of light and chemistry, gone as soon as the vessel cooled or the liquid settled. Still, the work continued. There was a strange comfort in the ritual. Laying out the tools, measuring the powders, tending the slow fire, the process became an end in itself. Even without the prize, there was the quiet satisfaction of watching the elements dance together, of seeing nature respond, however subtly, to the coaxing hand of man. Those who looked in from the outside might might laugh at the thought of years spent chasing a dream that never solidified into metal. But for the alchemist, the dream was never entirely about the metal. It was about touching the hidden workings of the world, even if only for a moment, about believing that behind the visible there was another layer, and that patient eyes might one day see. And so, in the quiet glow of a candle, with the faint hiss of cooling metal in his ears, the alchemist bent once more over his bench, and the first flicker of gold, not real but imagined, burned again in his mind. And so the hours lengthened, as hours do when measured not by clocks but by the patience of fire and the steady cooling of metal. The first flicker of gold remained a thing of the mind, a glimmer caught in the eye rather than in the crucible. But it was enough to keep the hand moving, enough to keep the lamp lit. The air in the workshop grew heavy as evening deepened. The walls, close and silent, seemed to lean inward as though they too were listening. The alchemist's fingers, stained with soot and ochre dust, moved with the memory of countless repetitions. The work was its own rhythm now. Grind, heat, cool, observe, record, then again and again and again. Until the years themselves began to feel like the same process repeated. Outside, the world turned. Empires shifted their borders, kings were crowned and buried, but in the stillness of the stone room, transformation, if it came at all, came like the creeping of lichen across old mortar. And in that slowness we find the next chapter. Chapter 2, lead in the crucible lead, the metal of weight, of dullness, of patient heaviness. In the medieval mind, lead was the farthest thing from gold. It was cold to the eye, reluctant to shine, stubborn under the hammer. And yet, in the strange ladder of alchemical thought, lead stood at the base of the great ascent, the first rung toward perfection. The crucible waited for it, blackened from years of service. The alchemist placed the lead within, not with the excitement of a sudden discovery, but with the calm that comes from knowing this was the way of things. Lead must be heated again and again until it surrendered its nature. Or so the text said. The fire beneath was not fierce, not the roaring blaze of a blacksmith's forge. It was a steady, almost meditative heat, coaxing rather than forcing change. Coals shifted and settled with quiet sighs. Now and then the alchemist would bend to feed them, his face glowing faintly in the red light. As the hours passed, the lead grew soft, its edges slumping like tired shoulders. It did not glitter, it did not dazzle, it simply became in its own slow way, something more open to possibility. This was the heart of the work, not the sudden transmutation of one thing into another, but the patient preparation, the wearing down of resistance. In the alchemical view, metals were not fixed in their natures. They were, like people, in a constant state of becoming. Lead, heavy and base, might one day ascend the ladder and become gold, not in an instant, but through long labour, through trial, through the slow persuasion of heat and time. The manuscripts that spoke of such things were themselves as dense and weighty as the metal they described. Ink curled into elaborate letters, their meaning hidden behind symbols and allegories. One could read for days and still feel as though one were standing at the threshold, the door only half open. But the alchemist did not turn away. The crucible stayed on the fire. The lead, now liquid, moved sluggishly in its vessel, reflecting the glow in dark, shifting ripples. To watch it was to watch the passing of a thought, the slow forming and unforming of an idea. And in that molten surface, one might imagine seeing the future or the past, as though the metal were a mirror held up to the hidden order of the world. Lead had a nature that the alchemist respected, though others scorned it. Where gold was bright and noble, lead was humble, even stubborn. It tarnished easily, softened in heat without beauty, and carried with it an air of melancholy. Yet this melancholy was not without meaning. In the ladder of the metals, a ladder that existed more in the imagination than in any mine, lead was the lowest step, but also the foundation upon which all else rested. Without lead, there could be no ascent. The crucible was its dark chamber of trial. From here, lead would be broken down, coaxed into releasing its hidden essence. The fire beneath was kept steady, for haste was the enemy of transformation. Too much heat, and the vessel would crack. Too little, and nothing at all would. The alchemist tended it as one might tend a sleeping child, with quiet adjustments, with patience that did not count the hours. Around the room, the signs of long work lay in quiet testimony. Shelves lined with jars, some full, some nearly empty, contained the fruits of countless preparations, powdered antimony, ground cinnabar, flakes of verdigris, and the glimmering crystals of salt. Their colours were muted in the dim light, but to the alchemist's eye, they spoke in a language older than words. Each had its temperament, its humours, its sympathies and antipathies. Lead was not worked alone. It would be married to sulphur, mingled with mercury, introduced to salts that might draw out hidden properties. The text spoke of such unions in human terms: the red king wedded to the white queen, the green lion consuming the sun, as though the metals were not mere substances but living participants in some grand and secret drama. The hours stretched. Outside, the sky shifted from blue to the deepening purple of twilight. Inside, the fire's glow became the only sun, casting shadows that swayed across the stone walls. The alchemist watched the lead swirl in its molten bed, its surface breaking and reforming like the slow breathing of a sleeper. Every so often, he would take a rod and stir the liquid metal, the movement deliberate, unhurried. In those moments, he was not merely mixing matter. He was conversing with it, asking it to yield its secrets, to show a glimpse of its truer self. The dark truth, unspoken but known in the heart, was that most of these conversations ended in silence. The lead would cool, returning to the same dull grey it had always been, its weight unchanged, its essence untransformed. Yet each attempt was a link in a chain, and perhaps the next link would bring him closer to the golden end. Patience was not merely a virtue here, it was survival. An alchemist who could not endure repetition, who could not accept that most days would end without triumph, would soon abandon the work. Those who remained were bound to it not by greed alone, but by a strange devotion, a sense that they were part of something older and larger than themselves. From time to time, the alchemist would set down his tools and step back, not to rest but to observe from a distance. In the shifting light, he would imagine that the lead shimmered faintly, as though hinting at the gold it might one day become. Whether this shimmer was real or merely a trick of the eyes, he could not say, but it was enough to keep the fire burning, enough to keep the crucible filled. Night settled fully now, and the air cooled. The only warmth came from the fire, the only sound from the faint crackle of the coals and the occasional settling of the molten metal. Somewhere far off, a bell told the hour, but time had little meaning here. The work was not bound to hours or days, it was bound to cycles, to the slow unfolding of change that could not be forced. And so, the alchemist leaned once more over the crucible, eyes half closed against the heat, hands steady in their ancient, repetitive dance. The lead glowed softly in its black vessel, and in its glow the promise of gold flickered, faint, fragile, but still alive. Lead had a voice, though few could hear it. It spoke in the hiss when a drop of water struck its molten surface, in the faint metallic scent that rose as it softened, in the dull ringing when a cooled ingot was struck. To most, these were nothing, mere byproducts of a simple substance meeting heat. But to the alchemist, they were part of a language without letters, without grammar, yet one that could be learned if one had the patience to listen. In the earliest medieval texts, lead was said to be Saturn's metal. Saturn, the slow planet, the ancient god of time and harvest. heavy in step, cold in nature, patient beyond mortal reckoning. To work with lead was to work with time itself, for it moved as Saturn moved, without haste, without yielding to any pressure, but that which came gradually, over years. The alchemist understood this. To place lead in the crucible was not simply to melt a metal, it was to begin a slow conversation with time. The crucible became a small, controlled world in which centuries might be imagined to pass in the span of a single night's work. The fire below was the sun, constant but never hurried, its warmth coaxing change from what seemed unchangeable. On a low bench near the fire's reach but not too close lay the tools of this dialogue, iron tongs, their handles wrapped in cloth, rods for stirring, small clay pots holding powders whose colours were muted in the dim light. Some powders were harsh, biting to the nose. Others were mild, almost pleasant. Each had its role to play, though that role might be hidden until the right moment. The lead, molten now, moved sluggishly in its vessel. Its surface was not smooth like water, but shifted slowly, like the back of a living creature breathing in its sleep. Occasionally, a bubble would rise and break, releasing a puff of vapour that curled upward and vanished in the gloom. The alchemist's eyes followed these curls, tracing them as one might trace the flight of a bird, searching for signs. It is said, though perhaps only by those who have never tried, that transformation is a matter of simple steps. Take the base metal, purify it, add the right agents, apply heat and wait. But the truth, the dark truth known to those who have spent years at the bench, is that each step contains 100 smaller steps, and each of those requires judgment, adjustment, and a patience that can wear the mind thin. The manuscripts were never explicit. They were guides written in riddles, meant to hide as much as they revealed. A line might read, "The crow must be made to fly before the sun can rise," and only the experienced would know that this meant a blackening stage of the metal before it could be brightened. The rest, the temperature, the timing, the choice of vessel, was left unsaid, and so many nights were spent in experiment, not with the expectation of success, but with the understanding that each attempt was a lesson. The lead, in its dull way, taught the alchemist to wait, to observe without forcing. It was not gold's brilliance that taught patience, it was lead's refusal to change without due cause. Outside, the night deepened. In the streets, the lust of the market carts rattled homeward. Dogs barked distantly, then were silent. The air grew still, as though the world itself were holding its breath. In the workshop, the fire's light flickered across the walls, throwing the shadow of the alchemist into long, wavering shapes. He leaned closer to the crucible, feeling the warmth against his face, the heat seeping into his hands. The lead gleamed dully, its surface broken here and there by darker patches, as though it carried clouds within itself. Whether those clouds would one day part to reveal gold, he couldn't say. But the fire still burned, and the crucible still held its charge, and so the work went on. The apprentice's hand hovered just above the smooth curve of the brass alembic, close enough to feel the faint heat that pulsed from within, yet not so near as to disturb the slow, deliberate breathing of the vapours inside. The glass above it trembled faintly, as if something unseen pressed against its inner surface, testing the fragile barrier between its hidden world and the dim-lit chamber beyond. He could hear the whisper, no louder than the turning of a page made as the liquid within sighed into vapour, and then condensed again into the trickle that slid down the copper coil. It was a rhythm older than any living voice in this room, a rhythm his master had told him had been kept by men and women who were dust centuries before either of them drew breath. It was in this moment, when nothing more seemed to happen than the repetition of drop after drop, that the boy began to see the strange truth of his master's teaching, that alchemy was not, at its heart, a chase for gold, nor even for power over matter, but for a power over one's own restlessness. For hours, nothing might change, and yet in some unmeasurable way everything was changing. The master did not speak. His gaze was fixed on the winding copper tube, but in truth it looked through it, past it, into something far older. He was listening, not to the water, not to the fire, but to the spaces between them. Outside, the light of day faded from the narrow slit of a window. shadows thickened, mingling with the stale herbs drying on rafters above. The boy's eyes began to grow heavy, lulled by the monotony, and it seemed to him that the master's shape at the far side of the bench was not entirely fixed, that the old man's outlines swayed, stretched, and sometimes seemed to be more than one person standing there at all. He blinked, and the shapes resolved into a single figure once again. Somewhere in the chamber, a drop of liquid struck a shallow dish with a sound that echoed far more than it should have in such a small space. The master turned at last and spoke, not to the boy, but to the air itself. "This," he murmured, "is the place where the second door begins." The boy felt a prickling at the nape of his neck. He had heard of this second door only in passing, in the muttered fragments of conversations between the master and the other adepts who came and went. It was said that passing through it was not a matter of steps, but of hours of thought, of losing one's place in time entirely. The master gestured and the boy followed. They crossed the workshop slowly, each step drawn out so that even the boards beneath their feet seemed to groan in a lower, more deliberate voice than usual. In the far wall between two high shelves of scrolls bound with leather darkened by centuries, there was an opening so narrow the boy had never noticed it before. They stepped through and the air changed. It was cooler here, though no breeze touched his face. The stone underfoot was smoother, worn by many more feet than the boy could imagine. And there, against the far wall, was a table of black wood upon which lay objects that shimmered faintly, though no flame lit them. "And now," said the master, "we begin the third chapter of the work." And without a pause, without any sense of an ending, the boy realized they had crossed into something wholly new and yet the same. The apprentice, still bent over the table where the brass alembic exhaled its thin, misty sighs, did not notice when the old master's hand slid across the rough oak and rested upon the page of the great book. It was not a gesture to halt the work, nor to hurry it, but rather a quiet reminder that there was yet more to the craft than the slow drip of vapours and the patient rise of heat. "You see," the master murmured, his voice low enough to be mistaken for the rustle of the pages, "the work is not in the vessel, it is in the mind that attends it." And as he spoke, the scene began to dissolve, not with the jarring swiftness of waking, but with the gentle unbinding of a dream that loosens one place into another. The faint smell of heated copper and oil-soaked cloth lingered, but the walls of the chamber seemed to shift, stretching upward into arches blackened by years of smoke. Here was not merely a workshop, but a hall, a place where others had once gathered in secret, long before the apprentice's time. Their voices, though gone, seemed to breathe in the rafters. Their benches, long since abandoned, still bore the faint stains of tinctures and the narrow grooves where knives had been set down over and over again. And so began Chapter 3, the Brotherhood of the Crucible. It was not a brotherhood in the sense of warmth or fellowship, for few among them trusted the other fully. They were bound not by affection but by necessity, for the path they walked was shadowed by suspicion from without and rivalry from within. To the outside world, alchemists were odd, sometimes dangerous men, secretive, wandering, prone to sudden wealth or ruin. The apprentice listened as the master's words turned from instruction to story, though the tone was unchanged, slow, deliberate, neither hurried nor weighted with drama. The Brotherhood had no fixed city. It drifted like the smoke of its own furnaces, gathering in back rooms, in shuttered attics, in the disused wings of monasteries where a sympathetic prior might turn a blind eye. Here, in these places, the rules of the craft were spoken, never written. What was written was for the eyes of the uninitiated, a veil to hide the truer work. They called themselves custards ignis, the keepers of the fire. To be admitted, one had to show more than skill. One had to show patience to the point of stillness and discretion to the point of invisibility. Those who asked too many questions were quietly sent away. Those who revealed too much were not spoken of again. The master's voice drifted through the hall like the smoke of an extinguished taper, painting pictures in the apprentice's mind of long cloaks brushing over stone floors, of hooded heads bent together over dimly lit manuscripts, of hands passing tiny stoppered vials from palm to palm as if they were carrying fire itself. And somewhere among these dim recollections, the sound of the alembic's drip returned, one drop then another, reminding the apprentice that he was still in the chamber, still at the table, still learning. Yet the world he now saw was larger, older, more hidden than he had ever guessed. The master's fingers remained resting on the book, but he no longer looked at the page. His gaze had settled far away into the place where memory and story blur, that borderland where events from long ago are not recalled so much as relived. "There were more of them once," he murmured, the words barely carrying, and not all made it through the winters. The apprentice did not ask which winters he meant, for the master's tone carried no invitation for questions. But in his mind's eye, the picture was already forming. Narrow streets beneath frost-laden eaves, shutters drawn tight against the wind, the flicker of lamplight from a high window where a figure bent over a cluttered table, breathing intercupped hands before lifting a quill once more. The Brotherhood of the Crucible had no lodestar, no temple, no great stone edifice that announced their presence. They were the kind of men who left little behind except for rumours and the occasional page of curious symbols found in the lining of a coat or the spine of a discarded book. Some had been scholars, driven from universities for their dangerous curiosities. Others had been apothecaries who found that tinctures and salves could do more than soothe the sick. That under the right moon with the right hand to stir, they might coax matter itself into changing nature. There were those who had once been priests, too, men who had chanted prayers over chalices for years until one day they began to wonder whether the change they sought was not in the soul alone, but in the very stuff of the world, and always there was the fire. In the Brotherhood, fire was more than a tool. It was the pulse of the work, the heart of the art. It was the first trial for any novice, to tend the flame without tending to the time. For hours, even days, one might be set to watch a small steady burn, ensuring neither flare nor fade. The lesson was simple but merciless. That transformation begins in stillness, not in haste. The master's voice moved as slowly as the smoke rising from an incense stick. He spoke of gatherings where men sat in silence for hours before a single word was exchanged. Of the coded taps upon a door, the knocks that varied by city and season so that no outsider might guess. Of the nights when the Brotherhood would scatter at the sound of hoofbeats, melting into alleys and shadowed stairwells, leaving only a warm crucible upon the bench to tell that they had been there at all. Once there had been a great meeting in the hills north of the river. The master did not say which river, for in such stories names only distracted from the deeper truth. He told instead of a low stone hall half buried in the earth, where 30 men gathered, each with his own small coffer of powders, oils and stones. They came not to share formulas, but to witness. For in the Brotherhood, seeing another's work was considered as binding as swearing an oath. One did not speak of it, nor imitate it, unless invited. The apprentice pictured the scene, the glow of coals under copper, the shifting gleam of glass vessels, the faint metallic tang in the air, as substances met and hid. He could almost hear the scrape of a ladle over the bottom of a pot, the dry whisper of parchment being unrolled, the cough of a man unused to the smoke. And through it all, the slow inexorable drip of the alembic beside him brought him back to the present, grounding him in the rhythm of his own small labours. The master's hand left the book at last and closed gently over the apprentice's wrist, not to halt the work, but to feel the pulse beneath the skin. "A patience," he said, "is the first metal you must learn to forge. Without it, the others will never hold." The words lingered, settling into the apprentice like heat into stone. He did not answer. He did not need to. The master had already returned his gaze to the coals. The shadows of the shelves seemed to lengthen toward the crucible's faint glow, as if drawn by some patient, unseen tide. In that dim and narrow space, the air thickened with the scent of oils and herbs ground to near forgotten powders. The apprentice, scarcely moving, felt time itself growing sluggish, each second stretching like molten leaf. Above, the rafters creaked, not sharply, but with that deep, slow-bending sound of wood that has been keeping watch for centuries. Somewhere in the deeper dark, a drop of water fell from a rusted pipe into a stone basin with such a soft splash that it might have been mistaken for a sigh. The old master did not look up. His gaze remained upon the liquid that trembled in the crucible, its surface shivering with tiny golden ripples as the flame whispered beneath. The books, Those ancient volumes with flaking bindings and edges feathered by the breath of decades leaned together like conspirators. Their shadows pulled at the base of the shelves, and in the quiet, the apprentice imagined he could hear them murmuring, not words exactly, but the low humming weight of secrets too old to speak plainly. It was in such moments when the fire burned low and the world outside seemed a far and meaningless place that the true work of alchemy began. Not the hurried mixing of substances, nor the impatient search for gold, but the long dream-bound waiting, the letting of one's mind dissolve into the slow dance of heat and vapour, the willingness to drift into hours without counting them. And in that soft drift, the borders of one chapter bled into another until the air itself seemed to carry the listener forward into the next part of the tale. The crucible's glow did not flare nor fade, it breathed. A slow, steady breathing of light that made the shadows swell and shrink in patient rhythm. The apprentice's eyes, half-lidded from the warmth and the dim, followed the slow undulation of brightness against the far wall, where ancient diagrams and curling parchment maps hung in solemn silence. The ink had browned with age, the edges curled inward, as though the paper had grown weary of holding its own shape. The old master's hand hovered above the crucible for a long time before lowering a pinch of powder into its heart. The granules sank without splash, disappearing beneath the molten surface as though swallowed by something far deeper than the vessel itself. A faint scent of iron rose, joined by the distant memory of wet earth after rain. From somewhere behind the shelves came a faint shifting sound, as though the very wood had stirred in its long sleep. The apprentice did not turn his head. He knew that here sounds came and went without visible cause, and that the effort to follow them often led only into deeper quiet. Instead, he let his gaze soften, so that the whole room seemed to blur into a single dim tapestry of light and shadow, glow and gloom, and it was in this softened state, this letting go of edges, that the lesson unfolded. The master did not speak. He rarely did in such hours. The teaching came from the way the flame leaned beneath the crucible without wavering, from the measured stillness of his hands, from the unhurried yielding of time itself. It was a teaching that could not be written down, for it was not knowledge that lived in words, but in the slow patience of watching, in the settling of the spirit into the shape of the work. The apprentice could feel the chapter bending now, not closing, not ending, but shifting, as a river turns its course so gradually that you do not know you have rounded the bend until the whole landscape before you has changed. And without fanfare, without even the faintest line drawn between them, the space began to belong to chapter 4, though the listener might not yet realise they had crossed. The shadows of the shelves seemed to lengthen toward the crucible's faint glow, each line of darkness sliding forward as though it too wished to warm itself at the pale steady flame. The apprentice's eyes followed the rise of a single wisp of smoke, so thin it might have been imagined, curling and vanishing into the rafters where webs swayed in some unseen draught. The master stirred the crucible with a rod of polished copper, each movement deliberate, as though to hurry would insult the work itself. Now and then the liquid inside shimmered with faint colours, green as tarnished bronze, purple as dried heather, gold as faded sunlight through old parchment. The light from it bled softly across the work table, touching the corners of scrolls and glass vessels until even the smallest vial seemed part of some vast, unbroken ritual. Outside, the night pressed heavily against the shutters. Once there came the distant creak of a cartwheel, then silence again, thick, swallowing eternity. Inside, there was only the small conversation between fire and metal, the hush of pages shifting as if in their sleep, and the occasional deep breath of the master, who never looked away from the slow transformation before him. The apprentice began to feel the weight of that slowness, the way it wrapped around his limbs, making thought itself heavy. He realised, without knowing when it began, that he had stopped waiting for anything to happen, that the stillness was the work, and the work was the stillness. Hours could have passed, or only moments, before the master finally spoke, his voice barely louder than the faint crackle of the flame. "A patience," he murmured, not as advice, but as a naming of the air they breathed. All things yield in their time. The apprentice bowed his head, not in understanding, but in surrender to the truth that hung there like incense smoke, felt, not grasped. The crucible's glow deepened to a low amber pulse, and in that gentle fading the walls of the chamber seemed farther away, the shelves taller, the ceiling higher, the world wider. And so, without any signal or ending, the moments of this chapter thinned like the last trail of smoke, and we found ourselves already stepping into the quiet corridors of what comes next. The gentle ebb of the crucible's glow faded entirely now, leaving only the dim wash of moonlight seeping through the high shutters. It lay across the workbench like a thin veil, silvering the glass of bottles, touching the spines of leather-bound volumes and tracing a path across the master's bowed hands. Chapter 4. The Vault of Forgotten Hours. There was a door in the far wall, one the apprentice had never noticed before. Not because it was hidden, though the shadows tried their best, but because it possessed a kind of stillness that resisted the eye, as if it wished not to be remembered. The master rose without a word, his robes whispering across the stone floor, and with a slow push, the door swung inward on hinges that did not creak, revealing a stair curling down into a darkness so thick it seemed woven. The apprentice followed, feeling the steps bend slightly under his weight. There was no railing, only the faintest glimmer of light ahead, as if a single candle waited at the bottom. Their descent was unhurried, the air growing cooler, more fragrant with the scent of dust and something sweet, like dried flowers long shut away. At last they emerged into a vaulted chamber whose walls were lined from floor to ceiling with shelves upon shelves of jars. Each jar contained not powders or herbs, but what looked like drifting clouds, wisps of light or shadow swirling slowly inside glass prisons. Some pulsed faintly, others lay utterly still. The candlelight came not from a flame, but from the jars themselves, their soft radiance painting the stone with pale gold and green. The master moved among them, with a reverence the apprentice had never seen, fingertips hovering but never touching. "Here," he said finally, "is where the hours come to rest." The apprentice frowned, his voice barely daring to rise. "Hours?" The master glanced at him with a smile that was neither confirming nor denying. "And not all hours are lived in the world above. Some choose to drift here when their work is done. Some are forgotten before they can finish themselves. We keep them safe. Or perhaps they keep us." He stopped before a jar whose light was faintest of all, as if the hour inside was close to fading entirely. "This one," he murmured, "was the last hour of a summer morning long ago. It never found its afternoon." The apprentice stared, feeling a strange pull toward it, as though he could step forward and fall directly into its golden haze. The master's hand rested lightly on his shoulder, steadying him. "You must learn to walk among them without longing. That is the first rule of the vault." And so they walked, their footsteps swallowed by the thick air, passing row upon row of hours, some bright as midday, others deep as midnight. The apprentice began to feel as though the vault stretched far beyond the chamber's walls, its shelves extending into places he could not name. Time itself seemed to loosen here. His breath slowed, his heartbeat became a distant thing. Even his thoughts began to drift like the hours in the jars. And just as the last of Chapter 4's early corridors began to fade, there was the hint of a deeper path ahead, promising not an ending, but a further descent into stillness. The candleless glow of the vault seemed to breathe as they stood there, softly swelling, gently retreating, like the slow tide of some invisible sea. Each jar's light was its own weather. Some cast warm sun hues as though they held within them the dying embers of a summer's afternoon. Others shimmered with the faint pallor of a clouded dawn, and still others glowed a dim bluish haze like the reflection of the moon in water. The apprentice's eyes kept drifting from one to another, drawn as though by invisible thread. His mind, which had been filled a moment ago with questions about their purpose, now felt strangely porous, as if some of the hours inside were quietly leaking into him, bringing not just light, but scent, taste, memory. He could almost smell a field of heather in one. In another, the dry tang of books left too long in the sun. In another still, the salt and iron tang of a winter ocean. The master moved ahead with the sure, unhurried pace of someone walking through a garden they had tended for a lifetime. His hand never touched the glass, yet he seemed to greet each jar with the smallest tilt of his head, as though acknowledging old friends. "This vault," he said at last, his voice a thread between them in the vast hush, was not built, it grew. "You must understand this before you can understand anything else here. The shelves, the stones, even the stairs you walk down, they are all the work of time itself, drawn here by the weight of what is kept within. They passed a jar that glowed the deep copper of an autumn sunset. The apprentice lingered, his fingers aching to touch. The hour inside was a swirl of falling leaves that spun in slow hypnotic spirals, never touching the bottom, never breaking apart. You may think these are hours taken from lives, the master continued, and in a way you would be right. But they are not stolen. They are given, hours abandoned, hours misplaced, hours never spent at all. They drift here, and here they do not age, they do not end, they only wait. The apprentice swallowed. A wait for what? The master's smile was unreadable, for someone who needs them. The air deepened around them, the way a room changes when a door is closed somewhere far away. The apprentice realized they were moving deeper into the vault, into the older shelves. The jars here were dusted in grey, their glass thick with the fog of ages. Some were so dim he thought at first they were empty, but then caught the faintest pulse, like a dying coal flicker from within. "These are fragile," the master said, pausing before one that held a thin ribbon of pale green light. A touch them, and the hour might scatter into nothing. That is why you will not walk this way alone. Not until you have learned the quietness required. They moved on, their footsteps making no sound on the stone. The apprentice could not tell how much time had passed. The vault seemed to stretch on without end, curving and folding in ways that defied the logic of the building above. It felt to him like walking inside a great spiral, each turn drawing them deeper, farther from the surface, and closer to some centre he could not imagine. At last, they came to a single shelf standing by itself in the open space of the chamber. Upon it was only one jar. It was small, plain, and its glass was clouded as if it had been wept upon for centuries. The light inside was faint, flickering weakly, but the apprentice felt it tug at him harder than all the others combined. "This," the master whispered, "is the last hour of the old city, when the bells fell silent and the streets were empty forever. No one knows why it came here, but it is the oldest we keep. Older than the vault itself, some say." The apprentice stepped closer, his reflection ghosted in the misty glass. For a moment he thought he saw not himself but a shadowed street, lanterns swaying in a wind that made no sound. Then the master's hand closed gently on his shoulder. "Enough," the old man said. "It is not ready to be remembered." They turned away, and the apprentice felt the pull of the jar loosen. Though it did not vanish entirely, he knew, without being told, that he would dream of it. The shelves began to close in again, the glow of the jars becoming more varied now, more alive. Some hours danced within their glass prisons, others floated as though the master spoke as they walked, telling of the times the vault had been sought by kings and thieves, how both had failed to carry away even a single jar. "They do not leave with those who have not given," he said simply. The apprentice thought about that for a long while, but before he could form a question, they had come to the farthest wall, a great archway of stone into which had been set a door of black wood. This one was bound with 3 locks, each shaped differently, one like a tear, one like a circle, and one like a keyhole that seemed to have no depth at all. "What is beyond?" the apprentice asked. The master's eyes were on the locks, the hours that have not yet happened. The words fell into the silence like a stone into a still pond. The apprentice shivered, though the air was not cold. The master turned to him, studying his face. "One day, perhaps, you will be allowed to walk there, but for now we go back." The way back was a slow climb, the glow of the jars following them until the shelves fell away and the steps rose into shadow. When they emerged once more into the master's workshop, it was as if no time had passed at all. The crucible still faintly warm, the moonlight still draped across the floor. The apprentice stood for a long moment, trying to hold on to the feeling of the vault before it could slip away. But already it was becoming like a dream he would struggle to remember upon waking. The master said nothing, only moved to the shelves, selecting a book bound in black leather and placing it on the table between them. "This," he said, "is where you will begin." The hour had deepened, and the air within the alchemist chamber had grown stiller yet, as though every particle of dust now hung suspended in a kind of watchful hesitation. Outside, beyond the warped shutters, the world might have been extinguished for all the light it offered. Within, the faintest amber flicker from the low-burning coals drew uneven glimmers along the brass-bound edges of books and the dull curves of ancient glass. The crucible on the hearth no longer hissed nor sighed. It lay in its own patient heat, as if it too understood that what mattered now was not motion, but the slow settling of all things into their destined places. Upon the oak table lay the parchment from earlier that night, the one whose curling edges had threatened to turn it into nothing more than a brittle relic. Yet it remained open, as though some invisible weight pressed its corners down, holding the inked symbols steady against the creeping distortions of time. The script itself, long lines of looping characters half familiar, half alien, seemed to shift slightly when looked at too long, so that one could not tell if the letters themselves were changing, or if the mind was merely faltering in its attempt to hold them still. The alchemist's hand, resting idly near the page, had grown cool to the touch, his long fingers bearing faint traces of some reddish stain that no water could wholly remove. His gaze, however, was fixed not upon the text, but upon the slender vial at the far edge of the table, a vessel so narrow it might almost have been overlooked, were it not for the peculiar depth of shadow within it. That shadow was not the absence of light alone. It was something heavier, something that seemed to drink in every glint that dared approach. A sigh, scarcely more than a breath, escaped him then, though whether it was born of weariness or recognition, none could say. He reached for the vial, but did not touch it, allowing instead the silence to lengthen between intent and action, and in that silence the chamber seemed to lean inward around him, the very walls bending in subtle degrees, as though eager to hear what he might decide. Far away, so far the sound must have travelled through corridors of stone and staircases spiralling downward into darkness. A single drop of water fell. Its echo reached the alchemist's ear as a dull, rounded note, and for some reason he closed his eyes as though listening for its twin, its companion drop, which never came. When at last he moved, it was with the deliberate slowness of one who knows there will be no second attempt. The vial was drawn nearer, its contents never stirring, its weight unsettling in the palm. He held it above the crucible, the unlit coals offering no warmth now, only the memory of heat. There was a long moment in which it seemed he might speak. Perhaps a word in that old tongue which had haunted the margins of his notes, but no word came. Only the faint, dry sound of glass against metal as he set the vial down again. His attention drifted then to the shelves where, behind a barrier of other jars and bottles, an object lay half concealed beneath dark cloth. He rose so slowly that the motion seemed to belong not to him but to the air itself, and made his way to it. The cloth fell away with a whisper, revealing a disk of some unidentifiable substance, its surface faintly iridescent, catching the light in colours so muted they seemed stolen from a dream. Upon its face were shallow engravings, circles within circles, a spiral that refused to end, and at its heart a mark that did not appear to have been carved at all, but rather was simply there, as though it had been waiting since the first hour of the world. He stood there a long while, studying it, feeling the quiet weight of all the hours and years and centuries that had brought this object into his keeping. Outside, the wind had risen just enough to send a muted creak through the timbered roof, and a thin breath of colder air slipped beneath the door. The candle nearest him shivered in its own wax, and a thread of smoke curled upward from its blackened wick. And so the night pressed on, each moment dissolving into the next without notice, as the alchemist moved between his relics, his symbols and his thoughts, shaping nothing, yet holding everything in that peculiar stillness that lies just before an unseen change. The last place we left chapter 4 was still deep inside that slow shadowed chamber, where the faint amber glow from the crucible wavered like a candle on the verge of sleep, and the air was thick with the mingled scents of charred herbs, old parchment, and something faintly metallic, as if the walls themselves had been steeped in the breath of iron for 100 years. The alchemist's hand, pale beneath its smudge of soot, moved only slightly now, as though every motion had to be weighed not just for its effect on the mixture before him, but for its effect on the hours themselves, which seemed reluctant to pass. You might imagine that here, at this exact pause, Something decisive was about to occur, a spark, a flare, a moment when all the patient grinding of powders and careful stoking of coals would reveal a sudden transformation. But in truth, such moments in the practice of alchemy, if they arrive at all, seldom declare themselves with drama. More often they creep in without fanfare, like a change in the season that you do not notice until you look back. So it was. The mixture in the crucible had not shifted its colour so much as it had deepened, as though its hue were sinking slowly through unseen layers towards some darker core. The alchemist leaned closer, though not too close, for he knew how volatile even the gentlest ingredients could become when coaxed toward the unknown. The shadows from the shelves, lined with glass vessels, clay jars, and the occasional unlabeled bundle wrapped in linen seemed to bend toward the light in subtle increments, their edges blurring, their forms uncertain. In the corner, a small brass scale stood idle, its pans balanced with an air of silent expectation, as if it too waited for the moment when weighing would once more be required. He reached for a slender rod of polished bone, its tip stained from years of contact with infusions and tinctures, and stirred the mixture in a slow spiral. The surface shivered almost imperceptibly, as if disturbed from a dream, and a faint hiss rose into the heavy air. It was not the hiss of steam or boiling, but a whispering tone, the kind that seems to carry syllables you almost understand if only you could lean far enough into your own fatigue. And here, perhaps, the listener, if they were to wander into such a place, would begin to feel the peculiar patience that alchemy demands, the sense that one could remain here for hours, not in boredom but in a kind of slow absorption, where time folds in on itself and the outside world recedes entirely. We may imagine then that the night outside the workshop had thickened. Beyond the warped shutters, the moon hung low, its light washed thin by mist. Somewhere distant, a church bell marked the hour, though it was muffled almost to nothing, as though the sound itself hesitated to intrude. The alchemist, hearing it, neither hastened nor slowed his movement. For him, hours were only measures for the impatient. Here, the true work kept to its own pace, which could not be rushed without ruin. It was in this slow turning of the stirrer, the quiet settling of ingredients, and the almost imperceptible deepening of colour that the remainder of the night began to take shape. The chapter would stretch on through these same rhythms, the gentle tending of flame, the weighing of powders no heavier than dust, the recording of observations in a script so deliberate that a single sentence might take an hour to complete. All of it, every moment, a step towards something that even he could not yet name, but which had already begun to form in the stillness between heartbeats. It is an odd thing how the oldest stories seem to travel farther than the people who first told them. They slip away from the villages where they were born, pass through hands and voices, and find their way to distant coasts, altered sometimes, forgotten in parts, but still carrying the quiet pulse of something remembered. In the first soft light of a long-forgotten dawn, there were no temples yet, no statues carved in perfect proportion, no books to hold the weight of words. There was only the low hum of the sea, the sigh of wind through reeds, and the faint scent of smoke from fires that had burned all through the night. Somewhere along the ragged edges of the Aegean, where the water folds gently into inlets and the rocks are dark with salt, a gathering was taking place. It was not a grand assembly, no banners, no polished floors, just a circle of people whose bare feet rested on sand still cool from the night. The elders, their hair silvered by years and by the drifting spray of the sea, sat nearest to the fire. The younger ones clustered around them, some sitting, some sprawled in the sand, their faces turned toward the slow-moving flames as though the fire itself were a storyteller. A single voice rose from the circle. It belonged to an old man whose eyes seemed fixed not on the people around him, but on some far horizon only he could see. His words came slowly, each one carefully chosen, not out of hesitation, but because he knew that the pace of the telling was as important as the tale itself. He began not with heroes or battles, but with the sea, always the sea, because in these first myths the sea was the beginning and the end. He spoke of the way the waves moved before time had names, when there was only darkness above and darkness below, and in between them a restless churning. The gods, he said, were not yet shaped. They were only murmurs in the water, voices without bodies, desires without form. And in those murmurs lay the seeds of every story that would ever be told. The children leaned forward, their eyes reflecting the red shimmer of the coals. The young men and women whose lives had already begun to stretch toward the burdens of work and the uncertain promises of marriage listened with a quieter kind of attention, as though they had heard these words before but still wanted to feel them again. The elders did not need to lean forward at all. They simply sat, the firelight softening the lines on their faces, and let the story move through them like a tide they had known all their lives. The old man spoke of the first land rising slowly from the sea, not in a burst or a roar, but with the patience of something that knows it will outlast the ages. He described how the stones were still warm from their birth, how mist clung to their edges, and how in that first thin light shapes began to emerge, shapes that were not quite human, not quite beast, but something in between. These shapes, he said, were the first guardians placed to watch over the meeting place of land and water. They had no need of sleep, no hunger, no thirst. Their only task was to remember, and what they remembered would one day become the tales told by human tongues. There was no rush to the telling. Between each fragment of the story, the fire shifted, sending up a soft trail of sparks that wavered and vanished in the wind. Sometimes the old man would fall silent for a time, letting the sound of the sea fill the space where words had been. No one interrupted. This was not the kind of tale that could be hurried. It was meant to drift slowly into the mind, to take root in the quiet places where memory and dream meet. Far above them, the stars were fading, their cold white light yielding to the pale wash of dawn. A gull called somewhere in the distance, and its cry seemed to fold into the rhythm of the old man's voice. He spoke now of the first journeys when the sea was both a path and a barrier, when each horizon was a question that could only be answered by sailing toward it. The people of that time, he said, did not yet have names for the lands they sought. They sailed not to conquer, but simply to know what lay beyond the reach of the shore. It was during these voyages, he told them, that the first myths began to take on form. Sailors returned with stories of islands that vanished when you approached them, of voices singing in the mist, of shadows beneath the water that moved with the grace of gods but the hunger of beasts. Some spoke of storms that spoke back to them, winds that called their names in tones that were neither threat nor welcome, but something stranger, an invitation to surrender entirely to the sea. The fire had burned lower now, the wood collapsing into embers. The old man's voice, though still steady, had taken on a deeper timbre, as if the telling itself had carried him further into the memory of these first myths than he had intended to go. He spoke of the gods taking shape at last, slowly, reluctantly, as though the sea did not wish to part with them. From the foam came the first of them, radiant and terrible. From the storm came another, dark-eyed and restless. From the depths where light had never reached came the third, whose gaze could still the hearts of men. These were not yet the familiar gods of marble and gold. They were still closer to the raw forces from which they had emerged, unpredictable, sometimes kind, sometimes cruel, always vast beyond human reckoning. The people who first told their stories did not pray to them as one might pray to a neighbour. They offered gifts instead, casting them into the sea with the hope, not the certainty, that the gods might look upon them with some measure of favour. The old man paused here, his eyes half closed as if listening to something in the air. Perhaps he heard the whisper of the waves echoing the voices of those first gods. Perhaps he was simply letting the moment stretch so that the final part of the story might sink more deeply into the waiting minds around him. He spoke then of the first temples, not of stone, but of open sky and salt air, where the worship was carried on the wind, and the offerings were left where tide and time could take them. And so he said, these early myths were not only about gods, but about the people who told them, about their journeys, their fears, their wonders. They were maps, in a way, not of places, but of the hidden territories of the human heart. Every voyage they took, every story they shared, became a way of marking those inner shores. The fire was nearly gone now. Only a faint glow remained, a heartbeat in the ashes. The circle began to break apart, some rising to tend to their morning tasks, others lingering for a moment longer in the thinning light. The old man did not move right away. He sat with his hands resting on his knees, his gaze fixed once more on that far horizon, as though the story was still unfolding there, just beyond the reach of the shore, and perhaps it was. For in the telling of such tales there is no true ending, only the slow turning of one tide into another, carrying the old stories forward into new voices, where they would be told again and again as long as there were people to listen. The air within the alchemist's chamber had grown heavier still, as though every particle of dust, every motor drift in the amber haze of candlelight had decided to linger rather than pass by. The crucible on the worn oak table no longer boiled with any visible urgency. Instead, its surface shivered occasionally, like the last faint breaths of something too tired to stir. Outside, the night pressed in against the ancient stones, patient and unmoving, its silence a perfect twin to the stillness. It was at this hour, when the fire burned lowest and the shadows lay thickest, that the alchemist's thoughts would stray furthest from the rigid confines of his ledgers and notes. He would lift his head from a page mottled with the smudges of graphite and ink, gaze into the dimness, and recall moments he had not invited, faces half remembered, voices he had not heard in decades, the shapes of landscapes he had once walked. These memories were not summoned in haste but crept in slowly, as though testing the strength of his mind's locked door. It is a curious thing how such recollections, once thought forgotten, can return not in clarity but in texture, the feel of a wind against the cheek, the dim gold of a late afternoon, the weight of a tool in the palm. Tonight it was the smell of crushed leaves drying near the hearth that opened that inner door. It reminded him of the apothecary shop of his youth, where, as a boy, he had first seen an old man grind roots into powder and call the process a preparing the seed of gold. He had not understood the phrase then, but it had lodged in his mind like a tiny bright shard, too curious to discard. The boy who had once stood in that dusty shop, peering over a wooden counter at a mortar and pestle, could not have imagined that decades later he would still be chasing the same mystery, nor that the chase itself would become a greater companion than any answer might prove to be. Perhaps that is the quiet treachery of the great work. It promises completion but offers, in truth, only a deepening spiral of questions, each more intricate and more personal than the last. From a narrow shelf in the far corner, the alchemist drew down a volume bound in soft blackened leather. Its spine bore no name, only a faded stamp that might once have been a crest. He turned the pages slowly, the parchment whispering under his fingers, until he reached a passage he had marked years ago. The ink was brown with age, but the words were still sharp. That which is sought must first be dissolved, and that which is dissolved must be bound again, else it be lost to the chaos from whence it came. He read it aloud under his breath, the syllables tasting faintly of dust and long-faded ink. The notion was simple enough to write, but endlessly difficult to enact. To dissolve was to destroy, to bind was to create anew. Between the two acts lay the abyss, both in the crucible and within the heart of the one who worked it. The candles swayed gently as if some unspoken breath had passed among them, and the room's shadows shifted in sympathy. He leaned closer to the page, as though the act might draw the meaning deeper into him, might make the riddle less elusive. Yet with each reading the line seemed to change, its meaning sliding away like liquid mercury under a fingertip. He set the book down with a sigh, not in frustration, but in the resigned acceptance of one who knows that such truths must be returned to again and again across years. They were not solved, they were lived. The alchemist's hand lingered on the cover of the book a moment longer, fingertips tracing the grooves left by the stamping press centuries ago. Such bindings carried the memory of the craftsman who shaped them, just as surely as the pages held the thoughts of the one who wrote them. He often wondered if the anonymous binder had ever read a single word of the manuscript they had so carefully clothed, whether they had paused, knife in hand, to consider the meaning of the phrases they encased in leather, or if they had worked without curiosity, content to finish the task and pass it on. This thought reminded him of an old belief whispered among certain guilds, that every book has two authors, the one who writes the words and the one who seals them away. The first gives the book its voice, the second its body. And like body and voice, the two cannot be separated without the thing itself ceasing to exist. He closed the volume gently, returning it to the shelf where it leaned against its neighbours like old companions in the twilight. The hour was deep, yet sleep had no claim over him. The night had taken on that peculiar quality where time seemed to slow and thicken, where the mind's attention became fixed on details that daylight would dismiss as trivial. He studied the way the candlelight curved over the rim of the crucible, how it drew out tiny glimmers from the surface of the metal like stars surfacing in a darkening sky. The crucible's contents, once restless, were now still as though they too had been listening to the turning of the pages. A faint layer of film had formed across the surface, delicate as breath on glass. The alchemist took up a thin rod and stirred it slowly, watching as the film parted reluctantly, curling back from the intrusion before melting into the rest. The scent that rose was faintly metallic, touched with the bitterness of ash. It carried him back, not to the apothecary shop this time, but to a different room entirely, one high in the tower of a monastery where, as a much younger man, he had been permitted to watch the monks prepare their inks. There had been vats of boiled bark, flakes of verdigris dissolved in vinegar, powdered charcoal so fine it seemed to float rather than fall when poured. The work had been quiet, almost reverent. No one spoke unless necessary, and when they did, the words were low, deliberate, as though each one must be weighed before it could pass into the air. It was in that tower that he had first learned patience, not as a rule, but as a lived necessity. The monks did not hurry because they could not. Ink that was rushed would not bind to the page. A page treated carelessly would not hold the words. Everything required its own time, and the time could not be forced. This lesson had followed him into every corner of his life, though he had not always honoured it. In his earliest years of working alone, he had tried to quicken processes, to urge fire and water and earth to reveal their secrets on his own schedule. The results had been poor, cracked vessels, spoiled mixtures, nights wasted in futile adjustment. Only later had he come to understand that each substance held its own rhythm, one that could be known only through quiet attention. To hurry was to destroy, and so now, in the middle span of his years, he had learned to wait. The crucible could sit for hours, even days, without him touching it. The book could remain closed for a month before he returned to the same page. The work was no less alive in stillness than in motion. Indeed, it often seemed more so. He set aside the rod and leaned back, allowing his gaze to drift beyond the chamber's low-arched ceiling. He imagined the sky above the roof, a vault of darkness lit here and there by the cold fire of distant stars. Somewhere beyond those points of light, other worlds moved, each holding their own mysteries, each perhaps with their own seekers of gold. Did they too keep vigil by candlelight? Did they feel the same pull towards something unnamed, something that could neither be grasped nor let go? Such questions did not require answers. It was enough to feel the shape of them, the way one might feel the contours of a stone in the pocket, without the need to take it out and see. A slow draught wound its way through the narrow slit of a window, stirring the flame. The candle bent and straightened again, its light briefly guttering against the far wall. The alchemist took the moment as a sign to rise. His legs, stiff from long sitting, carried him to the shelves where small jars of powder and fragment lay in uneven rows. He reached for one at random, a squat vessel of green glass sealed with wax. With a small knife, he broke the seal and lifted the lid. Inside, a cluster of pale crystals caught the dim light. They were sharp-edged, glinting faintly like frost caught at dawn. He poured a few into a shallow dish, hearing the faint click as they struck its surface. These would not be used to. He had taken them down not for their use, but for their company. Sometimes it was enough simply to look upon a substance to remember its story. These crystals had come to him years ago in a bundle wrapped with linen, a gift from a traveller who claimed to have gathered them from the edge of a desert lake. He had spoken of a place where the water was so still that the sky's reflection seemed more real than the world above it, where the wind carved patterns in the sand that lasted for months. The alchemist returned the crystals to their vessel and resealed it. He placed it back in its place between a jar of powdered cinnabar and another of crushed oak galls. Each item here was a story, each story a fragment of a larger whole. Perhaps one day he would understand how all the fragments fit together, but that day was not yet, and perhaps would never be. Still, the work continued, not because it promised an ending, but because the act of tending it was its own reward. The night had settled deeper by the time the apprentice returned to the workshop. Outside, the streets lay empty, their stones cold beneath the weight of unbroken hours. Within, the air seemed almost too still, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. The crucible on the workbench glowed faintly, its warmth spreading out in thin waves that barely touched the chill beyond arm's reach. The shadows of the shelves had grown thicker still, and now they seemed less like mere darkness and more like watchful figures, leaning close to witness the unfolding of some ancient, slow-breathing rite. The old alchemist stood motionless, his back slightly bent, his hands resting on the wooden lip of the table. His eyes were half-lidded, fixed not on the glowing metal within the crucible but somewhere beyond, as if peering into the centuries that had poured themselves into his craft. There was no rush here. The transformation he sought did not answer to clocks or candles. Time itself seemed a servant in this place, moving only when permitted. From somewhere in the rafters came the faintest stir, perhaps a draught, perhaps the shifting of an unseen wing. The apprentice looked up, startled, but saw nothing save the dim lines of beams lost in gloom. He felt an unease settle over him, the same way one might feel when stepping into a room and realizing it is not empty, even though no other living soul is in sight. The old man broke the silence at last, his voice a slow ripple over still water. "You think we are alone here?" "No. We are never alone when the work is true. There are eyes that see through smoke and shadow, and they have been watching long before you were born." The apprentice swallowed and dared a whisper. "Who watches, master?" A thin smile curved the alchemist's mouth, though it was a smile with no warmth. Those who came before and those who never left. And with that, he reached for a small iron key that hung from a chain about his neck and turned toward a cabinet in the farthest corner, a cabinet the apprentice had never before seen unlocked. The key turned in the lock with a sound that was far too loud for the hour, a deep metallic click that seemed to echo in the chest more than in the air. The cabinet door opened slowly, with a resistance that suggested it had not moved in many years. A breath of air escaped from within, cool and dry, carrying with it a faint metallic tang, like the scent of coins left too long in the dark. The apprentice stepped closer, his curiosity outweighing his unease. Inside the cabinet, upon shelves lined with blackened velvet, lay objects whose purposes were not immediately clear. Small vials of liquid the colour of tarnished gold, lengths of fine chain with symbols etched into each link, and a book so old its pages looked like dried leaves on the edge of crumbling. The alchemist did not reach for the book. Instead, he took a small jar filled with a pale, almost translucent powder, the sort that seemed to drink the light rather than reflect it. Holding it up to the glow of the crucible, he said only, "This is what wakes the watchers." The apprentice, chilled despite the gentle heat of the forge, asked, "Why would we wish to wake them?" The master's answer was a slow exhale. "Because they see what we cannot. And sometimes the path forward is not in our own hands." He moved with deliberate care, adding a single pinch of the powder into the molten metal. The reaction was subtle at first, a small tightening of the glow, as though the light itself were drawing inward. Then came a faint ripple in the air, the kind that distorts vision, like heat rising off a summer road. Shapes began to form within that shimmer. Tall, thin silhouettes, their faces hidden, yet their presence undeniable. The apprentice dared not move. The shadows did not speak, yet something passed between them and the master, a silent exchange, a bargain older than the walls themselves. Minutes, or perhaps hours, passed in that suspended stillness. Then, without warning, the shimmer faded and the silhouettes were gone, leaving only the faint crackle of cooling metal. "It is done," the alchemist said quietly, as though speaking too loudly might undo what had just occurred. "Now the work must rest, and so must we." But the apprentice knew rest would not come easily that night, for in the stillness of his own mind he could still feel the watchers lingering, unseen but near, as though the act of waking them had left some door ajar that could not so easily be closed again. The embers in the crucible gave off a low, rhythmic pulse, as though they had become attuned to some deeper heartbeat far below the floor. The workshop seemed quieter now, yet not empty. The apprentice felt the air had thickened, not in weight but in awareness, as if the room itself was listening, waiting. The alchemist closed the cabinet with both hands, turning the key only once, the mechanism clicking shut with finality. But it was not the sound of safety, it was the sound of something sealed away, something that might at any moment stir again. "They do not leave when the work ends," the alchemist said, his voice barely more than a thread. "They remain where they are called unseen to most, but never truly absent. Oh, that is why we speak little once the watchers have been touched." The apprentice nodded but said nothing. His eyes drifted to the great copper basin against the far wall, its surface covered in a sheet of hammered bronze, dull from years without polish. The basin was used only during certain alignments of the moons, the master had said once, and even then only in the presence of those who had sworn the oath of the hidden flame. Tonight was not one of those alignments, and yet something in the master's stillness told the apprentice that perhaps rules were being bent, if not entirely broken. The old man lifted the bronze covering with a slow, steady motion. Beneath, the basin was filled not with water, but with a black liquid that did not reflect the light. It absorbed the glow instead, as though its depth was infinite. When the alchemist leaned over it, his face was swallowed entirely in shadow, his features erased by the darkness below. "Look," he said simply. The apprentice hesitated, but the pull was too strong. He stepped closer and peered into the basin. At first he saw nothing, only the void, vast and absolute. Then, faintly, shapes began to emerge. A long corridor lined with columns too tall for the eye to follow upward, their tops vanishing into mist. Between the columns moved figures, the same tall, thin silhouettes he had seen in the shimmer above the crucible. They moved without sound, their long fingers brushing the stone as they passed. None turned their heads, yet the apprentice felt each one knew he was there. As one drew nearer, he saw that the figure's head was wrapped in many layers of cloth, its eyes hidden, its mouth sealed. Yet somehow, without speaking, it delivered a thought into his mind. "We remember the first flame. We remember you." The apprentice's breath caught. He stepped back instinctively, breaking the vision, and the basin's surface returned to still blackness. The alchemist replaced the bronze, covering slowly. "They know you now," he murmured. "That cannot be undone." The rest of the night passed in near silence. They did not return to the crucible, nor to the basin. Instead, the master instructed the apprentice to grind herbs into fine powder, to sweep the floor in precise, deliberate spirals, and to mark each doorway with a symbol of warding. These small acts felt less like chores and more like the stitching of a tapestry, one meant to hold something in place, or perhaps keep something out. When at last they extinguished the lamps, the room sank into darkness so complete that the apprentice could not see his own hand before his face. Yet from somewhere, whether from memory, imagination, or some deeper sense, he felt the watchers still moving, still standing guard over something that neither he nor perhaps even the master fully understood. The apprentice lay on his cot, listening to the soft, irregular creak of the old building. Sleep came slowly, and when it did, it carried him into a dream of endless corridors and the faint glow of a flame that never wavered, no matter how deep into the darkness he walked. The apprentice lay on his cot, listening to the soft, irregular creak of the old building. Sleep came slowly, and when it did, it carried him into a dream of endless corridors and the faint glow of a flame that never wavered, no matter how deep into the darkness he walked. In this dream, the corridors stretched beyond any earthly measure, their walls lined with ancient stone, etched with symbols long forgotten by those who walked the waking world. The flame he followed was neither bright nor fierce. It pulsed gently like the heartbeat of some great unseen presence, casting shadows that danced softly and never threatened to consume the light. With every careful step, the apprentice felt the weight of centuries press upon his shoulders, yet also a strange lightness, as if he were moving not through space, but through memory itself. The air smelled of old parchment and distant rain, of smoke from countless fires, and the quiet rustle of pages turning on their own accord. Somewhere far off, the faint sound of chanting rose and fell, its melody neither joyful nor mournful, but filled with the deep solemnity of secrets kept just beyond reach. The apprentice knew he was not alone in these halls. Figures moved in the periphery, shadowy forms that flickered like candle flames in the corners of his vision, always just out of focus. They neither spoke nor threatened, yet their presence was undeniable, as if the watchers of the workshop had come to accompany him into this realm between sleep and waking. He came at last to a vast chamber, its ceiling lost in darkness, its floor a mosaic of stars set into cold black stone. At the centre burned a hearth, though no wood or coal fed its gentle flame. Instead, it seemed to rise from the very earth itself, steady and eternal. Around this hearth stood a circle of figures robed in deep indigo, their faces veiled in mist. They turned slowly, their eyes bright as distant suns, fixating on the apprentice with a gaze that penetrated beyond flesh and bone. Without words they conveyed a message, one of warning, of guidance, of a task yet to come. From the shadows stepped forward a figure, taller and older than the rest, whose voice seemed to echo not in the air but within the apprentice's own mind. The path you walk is woven with flame and shadow. The watchers are bound to you now, and their gaze will follow every step. You must learn their language, listen to the silence between the sparks, for therein lies the truth that no eye can see. As the figure's words faded into the darkness, the apprentice felt the flame before him flicker once and then blaze steadily, illuminating a narrow stair that descended into the depths below. With resolve both hesitant and resolute, he stepped forward, leaving behind the circle of watchers and the chamber of stars. The stair wound downward endlessly, each step echoing softly, the walls narrowing, until he found himself in a vault of iron and stone. Here the air was colder, touched with the faint scent of ozone and ancient earth. At the vault's centre stood a pedestal upon which rested a single object, a small, intricately carved box of black wood, adorned with silver filigree in shapes reminiscent of twisting vines and alchemical symbols. The apprentice reached out, fingers trembling, and lifted the lid. Inside lay a crystal, pure and clear, yet glowing faintly with an inner fire that seemed to pulse in rhythm with the heartbeat of the world itself. He understood then that this was no mere jewel, but a vessel of the very essence he had sought, the elusive philosopher's flame, the heart of all transformation. Before he could grasp the crystal fully, the watchers reappeared, their forms now solid and close. They whispered in a language older than words, a song of creation and dissolution, of balance and chaos. Their voices wrapped around him like a veil, both comforting and terrifying. The apprentice realized that to wield this flame was to accept the weight of knowledge and silence, of power and restraint. When he awoke, the dawn was pale through the narrow window, and the workshop lay bathed in the soft grey light of early morning. The crucible sat cold and empty on the table, but within the apprentice's heart burned a new understanding, one that would guide him through the long, slow nights ahead. He rose from the cot, the lingering shadow of the dream heavy upon him, and prepared to meet the watchers again, not as a boy uncertain, but as one who had glimpsed the flame that never wavers, even in the deepest darkness. Chapter 6. The quiet communion of shadows. The morning light crept softly through the narrow window slits of the workshop, casting long, pale fingers of illumination across the worn wooden floor. The apprentice stood silently, the weight of the night's visions still settling like dust upon his soul. The memory of the flame, steady, unwavering, lingered in his mind's eye, a quiet beacon in a sea of shadow. Outside, the world stirred slowly. The distant calls of birds, the faint murmur of the wind through leafless branches, the soft rustle of a morning yet unclaimed by haste, all seemed to fold gently into the space of the workshop, mingling with the scents of old parchment, crushed herbs, and smouldering wick. Time itself appeared to pause, measured not by the ticking of clocks, but by the breath drawn between moments. The master alchemist sat at a heavy oak desk, fingers intertwined and eyes closed, as if listening to some secret symphony carried only on the currents of the air. The apprentice approached quietly, feeling the distance between them thick with unspoken questions and the gravity of new understanding. Words were unnecessary, yet inevitable. "It is not merely the flame you must follow," the master spoke at last, voice low and deliberate, "but the silence that surrounds it. The spaces between light and dark are where truth often hides, where transformation begins not in fire's roar but in the whisper of shadow. The apprentice nodded, recalling the watchers who had appeared, silent sentinels bound to flame and shadow alike. "They watch still," he said, "and I sense their eyes, even when they do not reveal themselves." "Oh, good," the master replied. "To acknowledge their presence is the first step. But to commune with them, to understand the language of absence and presence, is a task that few endure. It requires patience deeper than night and focus quieter than breath." Together, they moved to the far corner of the chamber where a thick tapestry hung, woven in deep blues and silvers, its threads shimmering faintly as if alive. Beneath it lay a door, small and unassuming, framed by stones worn smooth with time. The master's hand rested briefly upon the fabric before pulling it aside, revealing the threshold to a hidden chamber beyond. "This is the Sanctuary of Shadows," he explained, "a place where the watchers dwell most closely, and where the alchemist's mind may open to truths not seen by waking eyes." The apprentice's breath caught as he stepped forward, feeling the temperature drop subtly, the air growing dense and still. The chamber was small, its walls lined with ancient tomes and relics whose meanings had long slipped beyond common speech. Candles burned in iron sconces, their flames low and steady, casting flickering light that pooled in corners thick with shadow. At the centre of the room stood a simple stone altar, upon which rested a single obsidian mirror. Its surface was smooth and unblemished, reflecting not the room around it, but depths that seemed to swirl with darkness and faint glimmers of light, like stars caught in a midnight sea. "A look," the master instructed softly. The apprentice stepped closer, peering into the mirror. At first he saw only his own reflection, pale and uncertain. But as he continued to gaze, the surface rippled subtly, revealing visions not his own. A forest stripped bare by winter's frost, a distant mountain cloaked in mist, the slow turning of ancient gears beneath a city long swallowed by sand. "These are shadows of possibility," the master said, "paths that might be taken, echoes of choices yet to come. The watchers see beyond the present into the web of fate that binds all things. But to understand their vision, you must learn to quiet the mind, to become a vessel of patience and stillness." The apprentice swallowed, feeling the weight of the challenge settle upon him. He reached out hesitantly, his fingertips brushing the mirror's surface. A faint chill ran through his skin, as if the boundary between worlds had thinned, allowing something unseen to pass through. For hours he sat within the sanctuary of shadows, eyes fixed upon the obsidian glass, breathing slow and steady, until the images became less like visions and more like whispers, fragments of truths half remembered, feelings more than thought. Outside, the light shifted, the long morning passing unnoticed. When he finally looked away, the apprentice found his mind changed, less burdened by the need for certainty, more open to the quiet unfolding of things. The watcher's gaze no longer felt like a weight, but a presence, a communion as delicate as the flame that never wavered. The master nodded in approval. "You begin to see, not with eyes, but with the heart. This is the path of the true alchemist, one who understands that transformation is as much within as without." Days passed in this rhythm, study, silence, contemplation. The apprentice learned to tend the hidden flame, not with hands that sought to grasp, but with patience that allowed it to burn at its own pace. The crucible remained cold for long stretches, while his thoughts dwelled in the spaces between action. Occasionally the master would speak in riddles, fragments of ancient wisdom passed down through the veils of time. A gold is not the prize, but the sign. The true work is the transmutation of the self. Sometimes the apprentice would rise early, walking the narrow stone streets of the town before dawn, watching as the world stirred from sleep. He found that the quiet moments before sunrise held their own alchemy, where shadow and light mingled softly, and the air was thick with possibility. One morning, as a mist clung low over the hills, the apprentice felt a presence beside him. Turning slowly, he saw the master standing a few steps away, eyes bright beneath the heavy lids. "Come," the master said, "there is something you must—" They walked together toward the outskirts of the village, where ancient ruins rose against the sky, stones cracked and weathered, covered in ivy and moss, remnants of a forgotten past. Here, the alchemist's craft had once been whispered in silence before the clang of modernity and the march of time. At the centre of the ruins lay a stone basin, carved with symbols like those in the workshop, worn smooth but still unmistakable. The master knelt beside it, tracing the etchings with fingers calloused from years of labour. This basin was once filled with water from a sacred spring, he explained. Its waters were said to hold the power of reflection, not just of the body but of the soul. The apprentice peered into the basin, now dry and cracked. He imagined the clear, cool liquid and the way it might have shimmered under the sun, revealing truths hidden beneath the surface. Our reflection is not always easy, the master continued. Sometimes the mirror shows what we wish not to see. But it is necessary. If we are to truly change, we must face ourselves, fully and without disguise. The apprentice nodded slowly, feeling the weight of those words settle deep within. The journey he had begun was not one of simple discovery or secret formulas, but of profound confrontation with shadow and light alike. They remained at the ruins until the sun had climbed high, the day growing warm and bright around. When they returned to the workshop, the apprentice carried with him a quiet resolve, a readiness to face the slow, often solitary path of transformation, wherever it might lead. That night, as he prepared the herbs and powders for the next stage of the great work, he felt the watchers close, their presence a steady comfort rather than a haunting weight. The flame within the crucible flickered gently, steady and true, and the apprentice understood at last that the dark truth behind alchemy was not simply about turning base metals into gold, but about the patient, unending labour of turning shadow into light, ignorance into wisdom, and the self into something whole. The days lengthened slowly, slipping through the alchemist's workshop like a soft, unhurried current. Outside, the changing seasons marked their quiet passage, leaves falling with a gentle rustle, winds whispering secrets through the bare branches, frost settling like whispered blessings in the deep of night. Within, the apprentice's work deepened, each motion measured, deliberate, as if moving in time with some ancient pulse. He came to know the textures of the powders beneath his fingertips, the subtle differences in scent between crushed roots and dried petals, the way a single grain of salt might alter the balance of an entire mixture. The great work revealed itself not in sudden epiphanies, but in these small, patient moments, the careful mixing, the waiting, the watching. Each evening, the apprentice returned to the sanctuary of shadows where the obsidian mirror awaited. Over time, the visions grew clearer. No longer just flickers of distant possibility, but scenes rich with detail and feeling. He saw himself walking unfamiliar paths, meeting figures clothed in shadow and light, hearing words that were felt more than heard. And always the watchers remained. Silent, unwavering guardians of knowledge beyond the grasp of the waking mind. They did not judge or guide with force, but their presence was a constant reminder that the journey was never solitary. One night, as the moon hung low and silver above the workshop, the apprentice felt a shift, subtle but undeniable. The flame in the crucible burned a deeper gold, and the air hummed softly, like the resonance of a distant bell. He knew the moment had come to step beyond the boundaries of study and into the realm of transformation itself. With steady hands, he prepared the vessel, a simple flask of clear glass, etched with symbols of protection and change. Into it he placed the distilled essence of herbs gathered from the hillsides, the powdered crystals gifted by the traveller, and the faint dust that had settled over the pages of his master's oldest tomes. As he stirred the mixture, the workshop seemed to hold its breath. The flame's glow deepened, casting a circle of warmth that pushed back the shadows, yet within that circle, the darkness took on new depth, not absence but fullness. The apprentice whispered an old invocation, words learned from a fragment of a manuscript, their meaning obscured but their power felt. The liquid in the flask began to shimmer, catching the candlelight like liquid fire. He knew that within this mixture lay not only the hopes of transformation but the weight of consequence, for alchemy was never without cost. Hours passed in a timeless flow, the apprentice's eyes fixed upon the swirling depths of the flask. He felt his own breath slow, his heartbeat steady into a rhythm shared with the flame, the watchers, and the very air around him. At last the mixture settled, clear and still, but glowing softly with an inner light that seemed to pulse gently, as if alive. The apprentice felt a wave of exhaustion, not of the body but of the spirit, the toll of standing on the threshold between what is known and what lies beyond. The master approached silently, his gaze steady and approving. "You have done well," he said. "But remember, the true transmutation is not in the gold you seek, but in the self you become. The flame you carry now is both gift and burden." The apprentice nodded, understanding now that the path ahead will be long and winding, filled with moments of doubt and illumination alike. He wrapped the flask carefully in cloth, placing it among the other precious relics that marked his slow progress. As dawn broke, spilling pale light through the workshop's windows, the apprentice felt the watchers close once more, their silent vigil a reminder that no journey of true transformation is ever travelled alone. The workshop lay draped in a quiet haze as twilight deepened beyond the narrow windows. The fading light filtered softly through dust motes that danced lazily in the air, suspended like tiny stars caught in a gentle current. Outside, the evening breeze whispered through bare branches, carrying the faint scent of damp earth and distant wood smoke. Within, the apprentice moved with deliberate slowness, each step measured as if in harmony with the slow turning of the seasons themselves. The flame in the crucible pulsed faintly, a heartbeat in the dimness, and the watcher's silent presence felt nearer still, less shadow, more breath, as though the boundaries between their realm and his were beginning to thin. The master sat near the fire, a thick, leather-bound tome resting on his knees. His fingers traced the faded script with reverence, eyes half closed, as if he sought to hear the words rather than read them. The apprentice approached, careful not to disturb the fragile silence that hung like mist. "Dear master," he began softly, "the watchers grow nearer. I sense their gaze not only in the workshop but in my waking thoughts, even in dreams. What is the meaning of this? Are I beginning to cross the veil?" The master's gaze lifted slowly, revealing eyes that held the depth of many winters. "Oh, the veil is thin and always has been," he answered. "It is the space where the seen and unseen intertwine, where the mysteries of alchemy are woven not from metal and fire alone, but from the very fabric of existence. To cross it is not to step into another world, but to understand that all worlds are one." The apprentice considered this, feeling the weight of the words settle over him like a cloak. But how does one walk such a path? How do I move between shadows and flame without losing myself?" The master smiled faintly, the lines of his face deepening. "By learning that the self is not fixed but fluid, like the flame you tend. You must become both watcher and watched, flame and shadow, seeker and silent witness. Only then can the transformation be true." He closed the tome gently, rising with a slow grace. "Come, there is something I must show you." They moved through the workshop toward a heavy curtain of deep indigo, embroidered with silver thread that caught the dying light. Behind it lay a small chamber few had seen, a sanctum where the ancient rites of the alchemists were kept alive in whispered ceremony. The apprentice's breath caught as the curtain was drawn aside. The room was circular, walls lined with shelves bearing jars of strange powders, dried herbs, and peculiar artifacts whose origins were lost to time. At the centre stood a low table, upon which rested a delicate crystal prism, catching the candlelight and scattering it into fragments of colour that danced upon the walls. "This," the master said, "is the chamber of refraction. It is here that light and shadow meet, where the boundaries of perception are tested and broken. To understand the watchers, you must learn to see beyond the surface, to refract the world through the prism of your own soul." The apprentice knelt before the prism, watching as the colours shifted and blended, forming patterns that seemed both familiar and impossibly strange. As he gazed deeper, the room seemed to dissolve around him, replaced by visions of vast landscapes bathed in twilight, rivers that ran with molten silver, forests where the trees whispered secrets in languages forgotten by men. He saw himself walking those realms, a solitary figure moving between realms of light and shadow, each step a question, each breath a quiet invocation. The watchers appeared then, no longer distant shadows, but beings of shimmering form, their eyes reflecting the myriad colours of the prism. "You are on the cusp," one whispered, voice like the rustle of leaves. "The veil will part, but you must choose to remain bound to the world of form, or to journey into the formless depth." The apprentice's heart quickened, caught between fear and wonder. To cross the veil meant surrendering certainty, stepping into a void where meaning was fluid and time folded like paper. Yet the flame within him burned steady, a guide through the labyrinth of uncertainty. As the vision faded, the apprentice found himself back in the chamber, the prism's colours soft and still. The master's hand rested lightly on his shoulder. "Remember," the master said, "alchemy is not merely about changing matter, but about changing the way we see." The workshop lay draped in a quiet haze as twilight deepened beyond the narrow windows. The fading light filtered softly through dust motes that danced lazily in the air, suspended like tiny stars caught in a gentle current. Outside, the evening breeze whispered through bare branches, carrying the faint scent of damp earth and distant wood smoke. Within, the apprentice moved with deliberate slowness, each step measured as if in harmony with the slow turning of the seasons themselves. The flame in the crucible pulsed faintly, a heartbeat in the dimness, and the watcher's silent presence felt nearer still, less shadow, more breath, as though the boundaries between their realm and his were beginning to thin. The master sat near the fire, a thick, leather-bound tome resting on his knees. His fingers traced the faded script with reverence, eyes half closed, as if he sought to hear the words rather than read them. The apprentice approached, careful not to disturb the fragile silence that hung like mist. "Dear master," he began softly, "the watchers grow nearer. I sense their gaze not only in the workshop but in my waking thoughts, even in dreams. What is the meaning of this? Are I beginning to cross the veil?" The master's gaze lifted slowly, revealing eyes that held the depth of many winters. "Oh, the veil is thin and always has been," he answered. "It is the space where the seen and unseen intertwine, where the mysteries of alchemy are woven not from metal and fire alone, but from the very fabric of existence. To cross it is not to step into another world, but to understand that all worlds are one." The apprentice considered this, feeling the weight of the words settle over him like a cloak. But how does one walk such a path? How do I move between shadows and flame without losing myself?" The master smiled faintly, the lines of his face deepening. "By learning that the self is not fixed but fluid like the flame you tend. You must become both watcher and watched, flame and shadow, seeker and silent witness. Only then can the transformation be true." He closed the tome gently, rising with a slow grace. "Come, there is something I must show you." They moved through the workshop toward a heavy curtain of deep indigo, embroidered with silver thread that caught the dying light. Behind it lay a small chamber few had seen, a sanctum where the ancient rites of the alchemists were kept alive in whispered ceremony. The apprentice's breath caught as the curtain was drawn aside. The room was circular, walls lined with shelves bearing jars of strange powders, dried herbs, and peculiar artifacts whose origins were lost to time. At the centre stood a low table, upon which rested a delicate crystal prism, catching the candlelight and scattering it into fragments of colour that danced upon the walls. "This," the master said, "is the chamber of refraction. It is here that light and shadow meet, where the boundaries of perception are tested and broken. To understand the watchers, you must learn to see beyond the surface, to refract the world through the prism of your own soul." The apprentice knelt before the prism, watching as the colours shifted and blended, forming patterns that seemed both familiar and impossibly strange. As he gazed deeper, the room seemed to dissolve around him, replaced by visions of vast landscapes bathed in twilight, rivers that ran with molten silver, forests where the trees whispered secrets in languages forgotten by men. He saw himself walking those realms, a solitary figure moving between realms of light and shadow, each step a question, each breath a quiet invocation. The watchers appeared then, no longer distant shadows, but beings of shimmering form, their eyes reflecting the myriad colours of the prism. "You are on the cusp," one whispered, voice like the rustle of leaves. "The veil will part, but you must choose to remain bound to the world of form, or to journey into the formless depth." The apprentice's heart quickened, caught between fear and wonder. To cross the veil meant surrendering certainty, stepping into a void where meaning was fluid and time folded like paper. Yet the flame within him burned steady, a guide through the labyrinth of uncertainty. As the vision faded, the apprentice found himself back in the chamber, the prism's colours soft and still. The master's hand rested lightly on his shoulder. "Remember," the master said. Alchemy is not merely about changing matter, but about changing the way we see. The apprentice remained kneeling, the lingering colours from the prism still flickering in the corners of his vision. His mind drifted slowly, like a leaf borne by a silent stream, caught between waking and dreaming. The master's words echoed softly within him, to see beyond the surface, to walk between worlds. Slowly he rose, his movements deliberate and unhurried, as if honouring the weight of the moment. The chamber's walls seemed to pulse faintly with unseen energy, and the shelves around him held their silent vigil, jars and relics glowing faintly in the candlelight's embrace. Outside the chamber, the workshop had slipped into deeper shadow, the hearth's fire reduced to a bed of glowing coals. The air was heavy with the scent of smoke and ancient dust, mingled with the subtle fragrance of crushed herbs still lingering from the day's work. The apprentice stepped into the main room, his footsteps soft upon the worn floorboards. He paused by the crucible, now empty and cold, yet somehow still resonant with the echoes of the hidden flame. His fingers brushed the cool metal, and for a moment he thought he felt a faint warmth, like the memory of fire itself. Turning, he noticed a small folded parchment lying atop the workbench, which he had not seen before. Unfolding it carefully, he found a series of symbols and a few lines of script, written in a language both strange and familiar, the master's handwriting. The words spoke of the veil's nature, of the delicate boundary between form and formlessness, and of the necessity to embrace uncertainty in order to find true knowledge. The apprentice traced the letters with reverence, feeling the weight of their meaning settle deep within. He knew then that the path before him was not one of certainty or ease, but of constant crossing and returning, of moving beyond comfort into the realm of mystery, only to bring back what could be grasped and shared. The days that followed were filled with study and quiet reflection. The apprentice practiced the art of stillness, learning to quiet the restless mind that sought answers too quickly, to wait patiently for the flame's slow revelation. He sat before the obsidian mirror in the sanctuary of shadows, watching the dance of light and darkness, learning to trust what he could not fully see. The watchers appeared less as shadows and more as companions, silent guides whose presence offered strength rather than fear. Sometimes their forms shimmered at the edges of his vision, other times he felt their breath upon the nape of his neck, a gentle reminder of their watchful care. One evening, as a cold wind swept through the valley, the apprentice sat before the prism once more. This time, as he gazed into the fractured light, he saw not distant landscapes or shadowed figures, but a single glowing thread, a slender, wavering line of golden flame stretching between worlds. The master appeared quietly behind him, voice like the rustle of old parchment. That thread is the veil's seam. It is fragile and easily broken, yet it holds all that is and might be. To walk the path you must follow it closely, never letting the flame falter. The apprentice nodded, feeling the truth of those words settle like stone and water within him. He understood now that alchemy was more than a craft. It was a living covenant, a weaving of light and shadow, of fire and silence. As winter's first frost dusted the hills beyond the workshop, the apprentice prepared for a journey beyond the familiar. The master entrusted him with a small satchel filled with rare herbs, powders, and the crystal flask that held the distilled essence of transformation. "You must go forth," the master said, "to places where the watchers are strongest, where the veil thins, and the ancient wisdom still breathes in the earth and sky. There you will face tests, not of skill, but of spirit." The apprentice felt a stirring deep within, a mixture of trepidation and resolve. The path ahead was uncertain and shadowed, yet the flame within him burned steady and sure. Before dawn, he set out alone, stepping quietly through the sleeping village and into the world beyond. The air was sharp and clean, and the stars hung bright and distant overhead, like silent sentinels lighting his way. The journey took him through dense forests where the trees whispered secrets in the wind, across barren moorlands bathed in silver moonlight, and along ancient paths worn smooth by countless feet. At each step he felt the watcher's eyes, sometimes as warmth, sometimes as chill, reminding him that he was never truly alone. One night, deep within a hollow where the mist curled like smoke among twisted roots, the apprentice came upon a stone circle. The ancient monoliths stood tall and weathered, their surfaces carved with cryptic runes and symbols that seemed to pulse with an inner light. He knelt at the centre, unwrapping the crystal flask. The flame inside glowed softly, a beacon amid the shadowed ring. Carefully, he poured a few drops onto the cold earth. The ground seemed to drink the liquid eagerly, and a faint golden mist rose, curling like fingers reaching toward the sky. Suddenly, the watchers appeared around him, tangible now, their forms clear and luminous. They spoke no words, yet their presence conveyed a profound welcome, a recognition of one who had crossed the threshold. The apprentice felt a deep peace settle over him, the knowledge that he had taken a crucial step in the long journey toward understanding. The watchers would continue to guide him, their silent vigil a constant in the shifting tides of his quest. As dawn broke, washing the stone circle in pale light, the apprentice rose, his heart lighter though the path remained long and shadowed. With the crystal flask safely stowed, he turned back toward the workshop, ready to carry the flame of transformation further still. Chapter 8. The Whispering Vault. The apprentice returned to the workshop with the first light of dawn softening the horizon. The journey through the silent forests and ancient stone circles had deepened his understanding, yet the road ahead was still veiled in shadow. The watchers remained near, their presence woven into the very air he breathed, a silent chorus accompanying each step. As he crossed the threshold, the familiar scent of herbs and aged wood greeted him like an old friend. The master awaited by the hearth, eyes reflecting the flickering flame, a quiet smile tracing his weathered face. "You carry more than the flask now," the master observed, his voice low and steady. "You carry the weight of the unseen and the promise of the yet-to-be. Come, there is a place you must see." Together, they moved through the workshop to a heavy door, reinforced with iron bands and carved with strange sigils that seemed to shift beneath the apprentice's gaze. The master produced a small key, ancient and cool to the touch, and turned it slowly. The lock released with a measured creak, and the door swung open to reveal a narrow stair descending into shadow. "This is the Vault of Whispers," the master said, his voice barely above a breath. "A few have entered, fewer still have returned with their minds intact. Here dwell the echoes of alchemical knowledge, voices from the past that speak in riddles and silence alike. To understand the watchers fully, you must listen to these whispers." The apprentice swallowed hard, the air around the stairway thick with dust and the scent of forgotten things. Each step downward seemed to draw him deeper, not just into the earth, but into the labyrinth of his own fears and hopes. At the bottom, the stair opened into a vast chamber lit by pale, ghostly lanterns that hung suspended in mid-air. The walls were lined with shelves carved from stone, heavy with scrolls and tomes whose spines bore the weight of centuries. The faint hum of voices, barely audible, floated like a mist, twisting and curling through the shadow. The apprentice's eyes adjusted, and he saw figures moving between the stacks, wisps of form and light, neither wholly present nor entirely absent. These were the remnants of those who had sought the hidden truths before, their spirits bound to the vault by the very knowledge they pursued. A figure approached, draped in robes woven from threads of midnight and silver. Its face was veiled, but the apprentice felt its gaze pierce through him like a shaft of moonlight. "Why do you seek the watchers?" it asked, voice like the rustle of ancient parchment. "To understand," the apprentice replied, "to carry their flame without losing myself." The figure nodded slowly. "Then you must learn to hear the silence between words, to trust the spaces where light does not reach. Only then can you carry the burden and the blessing." The chamber shifted subtly, the shelves rearranging as if alive. The apprentice felt the weight of countless eyes upon him, the whispers growing louder yet remaining indecipherable. He closed his own eyes, breathing slow and deep, reaching into the quiet within. In that stillness, a single word emerged, not spoken but known. Patience. With patience, the chaos resolved into clarity. The voices became a chorus of fragmented wisdom, each phrase a glimmer of truth caught in the web of time. "The flame is not fire alone," whispered one. "It is the breath of the cosmos, the turning of the wheel, the dance of shadow and light. Seek not the gold of the earth, but the gold of the soul," murmured another. The apprentice listened, absorbing each fragment like precious ore. He understood that the watchers were not mere sentinels, but guides through the veil, keepers of the balance between knowing and unknowing. Hours passed as moments, time folding upon itself in the vault's timeless embrace. When at last the apprentice opened his eyes, the chamber was still, the whispers gone as if they had never been. He rose, feeling changed yet whole, burdened yet buoyed. The master awaited at the stair's mouth, a silent question in his eyes. "Did you hear?" he asked. "Ye did," the apprentice replied softly. "And I carry their words with me." The ascent back into the workshop felt lighter, the weight of the vault's silence now a source of strength rather than fear. The watchers greeted him once more, their presence a warm shadow at the edge of sight. That evening, the apprentice prepared the workshop for the next phase of the great work. The crucible was cleaned and filled with a carefully measured blend of metals, herbs and powders, each chosen with the patience born of whispered wisdom. The flame was kindled slowly, coaxed into life with reverence. As the mixture melted and shimmered, the apprentice felt the watchers close, their silent vigil entwined with the pulse of the fire. He knew the path ahead would demand more patience, more courage, more surrender. Yet, beneath the weight of these truths, a new light glimmered within him, a quiet flame that would not be extinguished. The night wore on, slow and unyielding, as the apprentice tended the crucible's flame with steady hands. The workshop seemed to breathe with him, the flickering shadows on the walls growing and shrinking like ancient spirits stirred by the alchemist's craft. Outside, the moon traced a pale arc across the sky, a silent witness to the unseen rites unfolding within these hallowed walls. The molten mixture inside the crucible shifted and churned, catching the flame's glow like liquid stars. It was neither metal nor mere chemical concoction, but something far more elusive, a living essence born of patience and whispered wisdom, of shadow and light intertwined. The apprentice's thoughts drifted, as slow as smoke curling toward the rafters, to the voices he had heard in the vault of whispers. Their cryptic truths echoed in his mind. The flame is breath, the gold is soul, the path is balance. These were not riddles to be solved, but melodies to be felt, harmonies that wove through the fabric of his being. He reached for a small vial of distilled essence, a gift from the master, and added a single drop to the crucible. The mixture responded immediately, glowing warmer, brighter, the fire deepening from gold to molten copper, then to a soft blue that whispered of worlds beyond sight. A sudden chill brushed the room, a breath of shadow that slipped beneath the doorframe and danced along the floorboards. The watchers stirred in the corners of the apprentice's vision, their forms more defined, their presence both comforting and unsettling. The apprentice bowed his head, murmuring a prayer to the silent guardian. He knew this was the crucible's test, the moment when the flame must not only burn but endure the dark that seeks to snuff it out. Minutes stretched timeless and the fire wavered once, twice, then steadied, burning with a quiet strength that seemed to pulse with the very heartbeat of the cosmos. From the depths of the molten light a shape emerged, vague and shifting like smoke caught in a beam of morning. The apprentice reached out instinctively, but the vision slipped away, leaving behind a whisper, a seek not the end, but the becoming. The words settled in the apprentice's heart like seed beneath fertile soil. He realized that alchemy was less about destination and more about journey, an endless unfolding of becoming, of transformation, not just of metals, but of self. The master's voice broke the silence gently as he entered the room. "You have passed the first trial of the flame," he said. "But remember, the greatest alchemy is not the turning of lead into gold, but the turning of shadow into light within the soul." Together they watched the fire burn low, its glow a soft pulse in the encroaching darkness. Outside, the watchers held their vigil, silent and eternal, bridging the veil between worlds. As dawn painted the sky with pale hues, the apprentice felt a quiet resolve take root. The path before him was still shrouded in mystery, but the flame within burned steady, a beacon through shadow, a promise of transformation yet to come. Chapter 9. The mirror's edge, the dawn crept through the narrow windows of the workshop like a shy visitor, brushing the walls with tender light. The apprentice awoke with the slow certainty of a season turning, the lingering warmth of the night's flame still nestled deep within his breast. Outside, the world stretched quietly, wrapped in the soft embrace of early morning mist that clung to fields and trees like a silken veil. Within the stillness of the chamber, the air held a delicate tension, the silent promise of change balanced upon the edge of possibility. The apprentice rose from his cot, each movement measured and deliberate, as if the weight of his journey rested upon the very act of standing. His gaze fell upon the obsidian mirror in the sanctuary of shadows, its surface dark and unreadable in the gentle light. He moved toward it, heart steady but curious, drawn to the mysteries it held, mysteries that had deepened with each passing day and each crossing of the veil. Kneeling before the mirror, he reached out slowly, fingertips brushing the cool glass. For a moment, all he saw was his own reflection, pale, uncertain, but marked now by the quiet fire of transformation. Then the surface rippled, and the mirror's depths unfurled like a dark sea, revealing a world beyond, a realm where shadow and light danced in eternal embrace, where forms shifted and intertwined like smoke carried on the wind. The apprentice watched entranced as visions emerged, fragments of his own path reflected back and forwards, scenes of triumph and trial, of flame and shadow intertwined. He saw himself standing at crossroads, faced with choices that bent the fabric of fate. A voice echoed softly within the chamber, neither the master's nor his own, but something older, deeper, a whisper carried on the breath of time. To walk the mirror's edge is to live between worlds, to embrace the uncertainty that births wisdom. Here lies the truth you seek, not in certainty, but in the dance of shadow and light. The apprentice's breath caught, heart quickening with the weight of the revelation. The watchers stirred in the corners of the room, their presence a steady pulse beneath the veil of silence. He understood now that the mirror was not merely a tool for seeing, but a gateway, a passage into the ever-shifting balance between being and becoming, knowing and unknowing and unknowing. Hours passed as he sat in silent communion with the glass, each moment folding gently into the next. The workshop around him seemed to dissolve, replaced by the endless horizon of the mirror's realm, where time was fluid and the self was both many and one. When at last he withdrew his hand and rose, the apprentice felt himself altered, more whole, yet infinitely stretched, grounded, yet poised on the edge of the unknown. The master greeted him with a nod, eyes reflecting the dawn's first light. "You have touched the mirror's edge," he said softly. And now comes the deeper trial, the journey inward, where shadow is met not with fear but with understanding. Together, they prepared for the next phase, gathering ancient texts and rare ingredients, setting the workshop for the slow dance of transformation yet to unfold. As the day waned and the flame in the crucible flickered steady, the apprentice knew that the path ahead would demand all his patience and courage. Yet beneath the quiet weight of this knowledge, a spark of hope glimmered, an unspoken promise that the watchers would guide him still through shadow and flame and light. The afternoon waned into evening as the apprentice settled beside the crucible once more, its flame a quiet companion in the gathering dusk. The soft crackle of burning wood mingled with the distant song of night birds awakening in the twilight beyond the workshop walls. He breathed slowly, deliberately, letting the rhythm of the fire guide his thoughts as he prepared the delicate blend of minerals and herbs that the master had entrusted to him. Each ingredient was chosen with care, each measured with the precision of one who understood that even the smallest variance could ripple through the work like a dropped stone into still water. The alchemist's art was less about force and more about harmony, an intricate balance between will and surrender, knowledge and mystery. As the mixture began to melt, the apprentice's mind drifted back to the mirror's vision, the endless horizon where shadow and light dance. He recalled the whispered voice, urging him to embrace uncertainty, to see beyond fear into understanding. The words settled deep within him like a seed planted beneath winter's snow, waiting for the slow thaw of awakening. The watchers lingered near, their silent forms woven into the dim corners of the room, their presence a subtle warmth that both comforted and challenged. The apprentice felt their eyes upon him, not as judges but as steady guides through the liminal space he now inhabited. Hours stretched on, time folding gently as the apprentice's gaze remained fixed upon the molten blend. The flame's colours shifted from gold to copper to a deep sapphire hue, each change marking a subtle transformation within the crucible and within himself. The process was a slow unveiling, a patient unfolding of hidden truths. At last the mixture settled into a radiant glow, emitting a soft hum that seemed to resonate with the very air of the workshop. The apprentice reached out, drawing the crucible closer, feeling the pulse of the living flame within. A sudden breeze stirred the candle flames, casting flickering shadows that danced like spectral dancers across the wall. The watchers seemed to lean closer, their forms shimmering with an otherworldly light. The apprentice's heart quickened. He closed his eyes, surrendering to the rhythm of breath and flame, allowing the boundaries between self and other to blur. In that suspended silence, the watchers whispered once more, not in words, but in currents of feeling and knowing that swept through him like a tide. "You stand at the heart of the mirror's edge," they seemed to say. "Here, transformation is not a thing to be grasped, but a dance to be lived. The apprentice opened his eyes slowly, the glow of the crucible mirrored in their depths. He felt both smaller and larger than himself, a single note in the vast symphony of becoming. When the master finally spoke, it was with a voice touched by reverence. You have walked the mirror's edge and returned with the light of understanding. Now the path narrows, into the self, into the flame that burns unseen. The apprentice nodded, knowing that the greatest trial still awaited. The watcher's presence was no longer a distant shadow but a living force entwined with his own breath. As night deepened, the workshop settled into a sacred hush, the flickering flame a beacon in the vast sea of shadow. The apprentice sat in stillness, poised between worlds, ready to walk the inward path where all alchemy of metal, spirit and soul must ultimately be made manifest. Chapter 10. The eternal flame the workshop lay in silence, bathed in the muted glow of dawn filtering through narrow stained-glass windows. The apprentice stood before the crucible, its once turbulent flames now a steady, unwavering light, an eternal flame that seemed to pulse with the very rhythm of the cosmos. The air was thick with the scent of burnt herbs and ancient wood smoke, the residue of countless nights spent in patient labour and silent vigil. His hands, calloused yet gentle, moved with the grace of one who has come to know the sacredness of slow work, the measured turning of elements, the whispered prayers offered to unseen watchers, the delicate balance between fire and shadow. Each motion was deliberate, echoing the steady cadence of his own transformed spirit. Around him, the workshop held its breath, as though aware that the culmination of the great work was near, the moment when lead becomes gold, not just in metal, but in soul, when shadow is alchemized into light and the flame within is made manifest. The master stood nearby, eyes reflecting both pride and quiet solemnity. You have come far beyond what many dare to dream. Yet remember, the flame you carry is both beginning and end, the circle unbroken. The apprentice nodded, feeling the weight of those words settle deep within. He recalled the journey, each slow step along shadowed corridors, each whispered lesson in the vault of whispers, each moment at the mirror's edge where uncertainty gave way to understanding. With steady hands, he prepared the final mixture, combining the distilled essences, the sacred powders, and the purified metals. The crucible's flame brightened, dancing with hues of gold and blue, casting shifting patterns upon the worn stone walls. As the mixture melted and fused, the apprentice closed his eyes, allowing the flame's warmth to seep into his very being. He felt the watchers near, no longer distant shadows, but radiant guides, whose silent vigil had carried him through doubt and revelation alike. Time seemed to stretch and fold, each second a lifetime, each breath a bridge between worlds. The apprentice opened his eyes to see the molten gold glowing softly within the crucible, a symbol not of material wealth but of transformation fulfilled. The master approached, placing a hand upon the apprentice's shoulder. "The great work is never truly complete," he whispered. "It is the eternal flame, burning, changing, illuminating the path ahead. Carry it well." The apprentice felt a quiet peace settle over him, the flame within steady and bright, a beacon in the endless dance of shadow and light. The apprentice remained by the crucible long after the golden mixture had cooled into a smooth, gleaming metal, its surface capturing the flickering firelight like a silent promise. The room around him was hushed, the only sound the gentle crackle of embers fading in the hearth and the soft rustle of wind beyond the shuttered windows. He reflected on the long journey that had brought him here, through shadowed chambers of doubt and revelation, across the fragile veil between worlds, into the depths of the alchemist's art, where transformation was both an external act and a sacred internal unfolding. Each step had demanded patience, courage, and a surrender to the unknown, yet also the cultivation of a flame that burns steady through every trial. The watchers, once distant and mysterious, had become companions, silent witnesses to his becoming. Now, as he held the shining gold in his hands, the apprentice understood more clearly than ever that this metal was but a symbol, an outward sign of an inward truth. The true gold was the light kindled within, the eternal flame that no darkness could extinguish. The master joined him once more, his gaze steady and serene. "You have walked the path well," he said softly. "Yet remember, the flame is not a prize to be grasped, but a living presence to be tended. It is both beginning and end, and every moment in between." The apprentice bowed his head, feeling the profound weight of the charge. He knew the work was never truly done. Each transformation would lead to another, deeper and more subtle. The great work was a cycle without end, an endless turning of lead into gold, shadow into light, self into becoming. As the sun rose higher, spilling warm light through the windows, the apprentice prepared to seal the gold within a vessel crafted by the master. A small, intricately worked flask designed to hold not just metal, but the very essence of transformation. He lifted the vessel to the light, watching as the gold shimmered within, a quiet flame contained yet unbound. It was a talisman of all he had learned and all he was still to become. Outside, the watchers remained, their silent vigil eternal, bridging the space between worlds. The apprentice knew he would carry their presence always, as guide, companion, and reminder of the sacred flame within. With a final glance around the workshop, the apprentice stepped into the dawn, the eternal flame glowing softly beneath his cloak, a light to carry forward into the unknown.